The emergence of the Inuit as a distinct spirit people cannot be understood without first descending into the glacial corridors of the late Pleistocene, when ice ruled the northern hemisphere and the bones of the land lay buried beneath leagues of white silence. It was between 28,000 and 15,000 years before our counting that a pathway opened, a corridor of ice and exposed seafloor between northeastern Siberia and the northwestern coasts of what is now Alaska. This was Beringia, the threshold of continents, a bridge not of conquest, but of migration sanctified by cold breath and ancestral longing. Here the Proto-Inuit did not rise as a single tribe, nor under chieftain's banner, but as a movement, slow, sacred, and enduring. They were a people guided not by conquest, but by the stars, the animal tracks carved into snow, and the cold logic of survival. They followed the herds of mammoth and muskox across plains of snow that stretched to the horizon. Wrapped in furs, wielding chipped blades of stone and bone, they crossed the white wasteland not as wanderers, but as witnesses to a world in transition, when land gave way to water and cold became the shaping spirit of identity. No trees marked this origin. No rivers murmured. Only wind, the sky's breath, and the echo of footfalls on frost-hardened ground. In this silence, the Inuit were born, not named, but felt. An ancestral current wrapped in sealskin, carved from driftwood, fed on marrow and snow. Their villages were not yet villages. They were shelters dug into the earth, mounds of tundra shaped against the wind, circular and half-hidden, like the bellies of sleeping bears. Their first tools were sacred, for every item was earned. Blades chipped from obsidian and chert glistened like ice. Awls carved from bone stitched skins into form. Needles, more valuable than spears, were kissed by women before piercing their hide. And the fire, so rare, so holy, it was fed with fat more than wood, for no forests grew where they dwelled. It crackled in lamps carved from soapstone, its flame low and bluish, flickering like the memory of summer. Burial among them was not yet fixed in custom, but already sacred. The body was wrapped in furs and placed within the earth or snow, not out of grief alone, but reverence. To die was to return to the great cold, to become one with the ancestors who still whispered in the wind. Around some bones we find red ochre, and in others, the curve of antlered tools, offerings for the journey beneath the ice. Their migration was not a line, but a pulse, north and east, then south and west, across the long centuries. Archaeologists trace them from the Yana River in Siberia, c. 27,000 BCE, where tools were found beneath layers of loess and frost, to the Bluefish Caves in Yukon, where caribou bones scored with human blade marks hint at ancient encampments beneath the northern lights. Their footprints, long erased by snow, remain in hearths of charred seal fat and flaked lithics scattered like prayers across the tundra. They did not name themselves Inuit, not yet. That would come later. In these early millennia, they were the quiet ones, the breathless ones, the people of flint and ice. In the myths that would later be carved into memory, they were born of Sedna's severed fingers, cast into the sea to become the creatures they would hunt. They were children of the moon, whose pale light guided them over the ice, and of the raven, who taught them the cunning of warmth. The cold shaped not only their movement, but their minds. In a world where nothing could be wasted, every act became ritual. The killing of a seal required apology, the cutting of its flesh ceremony, songs were whispered over snow before travel, tools were named and spoken to. Even the dogs, which first arrived with them across the straits, were honored as companions of the spirit path. The earliest sleds were not yet built, but the bond between dog and man was already written in shared hunger and night breath. And always the sky watched, a vast dome of shifting clouds filled with stars too sharp to touch. The aurora came as a promise and a warning, dancing, writhing, flashing green and white like the spirits of the dead playing in the firmament. Some would say they were the souls of hunters lost in snowstorms, returning to light the way. Others whispered they were the unborn, seeking mothers brave enough to carry them across the long dark. This was the world before names, a world of silence, breath, and migration. The ancestors moved slowly, always with the wind, across ice that remembered no footsteps. And somewhere between the Siberian frost and the Alaskan dawn, the spirit that would one day be Inuit first exhaled into the cold. They were not yet a people, but they had begun to remember. The establishment of Inuit identity cannot be separated from the sanctity of the Arctic itself, a vast land not by distance alone, but by silence, sky, and the absence of trees, between the third and firs. T millennia BCE, the cultural seed of the Inuit was nourished not in fertile valleys or river-fed plains, but in the hollow stillness of the tundra, where snow layered itself like memory and the wind carried no voice but the ancestors. This land, stretching from the Bering Strait through the Beaufort Sea, across the barrens of Nunavut and the archipelagos of the high Arctic, whispered in hues of white, blue, and bone. Archaeological traces of the earliest Paleo-Eskimo traditions, the Denby, the Sakak, and the Independence cultures, remain buried beneath frost-hardened layers near Greenland's coast, across Ellesmere Island, and along the Mackenzie Delta. Blade fragments, bruins, and micro-tools of stone are found beside hearths no longer burning, clustered in semi-subterranean dwellings sealed with snow. From the pre-Dorset cultures, which emerged around 2500 BCE, to the more spiritually distinct Dorset peoples of 500 BCE to 1500 CE, each lineage left offerings to time: bone harpoon heads with trilobed holes, soapstone lamps blackened by seal oil, ivory effigies carved with hollow eyes, and snow-wrapped silence. The Inuit did not tame this land. They entered into a covenant with it. Unlike the steppe riders or river valley kings, they built no ziggurats nor walled cities, but domes of reverence. The igloo, in form and function, was a cathedral of cold, a parabolic shell of snow that held in warmth like a secret. Its entrance was tunneled to humble the body, and its inner sanctum was smooth and round, echoing the shape of the moon. Inside, fire danced low on a soapstone lamp, fed by fat drawn from the bodies of beasts who had given themselves to the hunt. To the outside eye, their world appeared empty, but it was rich with unspoken offerings. They saw the land not as wilderness but as scripture. The snowdrifts bore direction, the winds held voices, the pressure ridges on frozen seas sang of the seasons turning. The Inuit learned to read these inscriptions, each crack in the ice, each whisper of wind through stone, until they no longer needed maps. Their memories were enough. Their bodies carried geographies. Ritual did not come in temples but in motion. The building of a snow shelter, the cutting of blubber, the preparation of sinew thread, all were forms of worship. And there was grief too, wrapped into every act of survival. Each animal slain was spoken to. The seal's spirit, it was believed, would remain near, listening. To honor it, hunters placed fresh water in the mouth of the dead, a ritual of gentleness, of apology. The bear, a sacred adversary, was dismembered in silence, its skull placed high or buried deeply, so its soul would not see its own destruction. These were people of the sky wound, the horizon of dusk and dawn that bled amber for hours before dark. The long night taught patience, the long day endurance. And within this strange rhythm, stories were shaped, not in ink, but in windsong and bone. The Inuit oral tradition preserved not only names, but cosmologies. One tale whispered of a man who married the sea woman, losing his hands in the bargain, gaining instead the gift of foresight. Another spoke of giants who stalked the land in hunger, turned to stone for their pride. The land remembered. The stones themselves were said to murmur when the old gods passed by. The Dorset left behind ghostly tools, delicately carved polar bear figurines, shamanic amulets of walrus ivory, flint knives etched with star marks. Their villages lay beneath drifts now, their people vanished by the time the Thule, the direct ancestors of the modern Inuit, began migrating eastward around 1000 CE. Yet even now, Inuit elders speak of the Tunit, an older race with strength unmatched, who could lift massive stones and run silently over ice. Perhaps they were memories, perhaps they were Dorset. In the sacred history of the North, myth and archaeology blur like snow in the wind. Metal was a rarity and a blessing. Before the arrival of Norse trade routes or drift copper from the Mackenzie, tools were fashioned from what the land offered: bone, ivory, stone. The sinews of caribou, the baleen of whales, the tusks of narwhal, each material held spirit, each bore a name. The arrival of meteoric iron, called tuk-tuk ujala, from fragments fallen from heaven, was treated as a sacred substance. It was hammered, not smelted, and carried in skin-wrapped bundles like relics of the sky. There were no kings among them, but there were elders and there were shamans. The Angakok was a walker between worlds, an interpreter of breath and illness, of birth and storm. They spoke with the wind and sang to the animals. They guided souls. Their tools, drums carved from stretched seal stomach, masks of driftwood and feather, were buried with them or broken to release their power. Few graves remain intact, but where they do, they speak of reverence. The dead were wrapped in skins, adorned with ivory beads, and placed beneath stone cairns on hills, where they could see the sea. This was not a land of conquest, but of intimacy, not of warbands or siege towers, but of migrations, memories, and meanings carried on sled runners across windswept ice. The people did not mark territory with flags, but with place names spoken in rhythm with the tongue: Ikalaktuchiak, where the fish pass; Korsutuk, where the sun does not rise. Here in the white breath of the earth, where bones freeze before they decay and the wind is older than any kingdom, the Inuit carved not dominion, but belonging, and still the land whispers. The spiritual cosmology of the early Inuit cannot be understood apart from the silence in which it was born. Among the Thule, whose cultural expansion between 1000 and 1600 CE would become the spine of Inuit identity, religion was not an institution. It was a breath, a rhythm, a reverence that saturated all motion. The land was not dead matter, but living, watching, speaking. Beneath each snowdrift slept a soul, beneath each hunt a pact, and in the curling smoke of the soapstone lamp, spirits whispered in tongues older than memory. The Angakok, the Inuit shaman, was not a priest, nor a prophet, but a vessel. They moved not among crowds, but among shadows. Through trance and solitude, through drumming that echoed like a heartbeat within the ribcage of an igloo, they entered the other wind. The tools of their journey were few but sacred: a drum made from stretched stomach and driftwood, a bone amulet etched with animal forms, a mask carved from weathered ivory, worn only when the soul walked beyond the ice. Inside those trances, the Angakok spoke to the Tuangate, helping spirits, neither good nor evil, but old, powerful, and watching. Some took the form of polar bears, others of wolves or sea beasts with eyes like flickering lamps. They danced not in air, but in fire, in breath, in the northern lights. Auroral veils that rippled across the frozen sky were seen as their garments, the sacred robes of the departed, twirling in celebration or warning. In the dark months, when the sun did not rise, the Angakok would sit in silence, staring into the flame. This was not absence, it was communion. One chant could last hours, one breath carried for miles in the cold. And when they emerged from trance, they would whisper truths not heard in waking. A storm was not just weather, it was the anger of Sedna, the sea mother. A sickness was not merely affliction, it was a soul dislodged, offended, or lost. The myth of Sedna is written not in texts, but in sky, sea, and sorrow. In its earliest oral forms, passed along the coasts of Baffin and across the channels of Ungava Bay, Sedna was a daughter betrayed. Her fingers, severed by her father as she clung to the side of a kayak, fell into the sea and became the seals, the walruses, the whales. She sank beneath the waves, hair tangled in seaweed, her mood ever shifting. When the game grew scarce, it was because Sedna had turned her face away. And only the Angakok could dive to her realm, not with body, but with spirit, combing her hair, soothing her rage, begging her to open her hand once more. Burial among the Inuit was not silence, but return. The dead were not removed from the world, but enfolded deeper into it. Some were laid upon high rocks, others interred in snow-wrapped cairns, stones stacked like ribs around the fallen. Grave goods were simple, but always meaningful: a favorite knife, a piece of sinew thread, a carved animal companion. The soul, it was believed, would follow the trail of the wind, guided by stars and memory. But not all spirits departed. Some lingered in the cold. Among the drifted stories passed from camp to camp were the Ijaset, shifting ones, shadows that took form and vanished before a second glance. They were said to move swiftly across the tundra, their feet leaving no tracks, their voices caught only in the edges of wind. Hunters who went alone sometimes did not return. Others came back changed, eyes distant, speech halting, as if they had seen too much of what lay beneath the snow. The landscape was haunted not by ghosts, but by presence. The The bones of whale ribs frozen into the ice became markers of ancestral paths. The tusks of walrus embedded in village thresholds were thresholds themselves between worlds. There was no sharp boundary between life and death. The breath that left the mouth in the cold became mist, then wind, then voice. And children were named after the departed not as remembrance, but continuation. The soul moved, re-entered, and resumed. Among the most sacred were the kill-out, the drums. Their circular form mirrored the horizon. Their beat summoned not only the living, but the watchful dead. Each drum was unique, carved in secret, consecrated with blood or breath. Some held carvings of hands or spirits or creatures half seal and half man. The shaman would strike it not with rage but rhythm, and the beat would echo through the body, opening pathways into the unseen. Fire was Neve. Or merely flame, it was spirit. The oil lamp or quilic burned with fat harvested from the seal's body, a gift, a grief, a light that fed on life. It warmed the igloo, cooked the food, and stood at the center of myth. In one tale, the sun and moon were siblings chasing each other through the sky. When the lamp went out, darkness swallowed the earth, and the soul lost its way. To let the flame die was not merely coldness, it was forgetting. Dreams were not illusions, they were maps. The Angakok trained from childhood to interpret them. A bear appearing in the distance might mark a coming death or a blessing. A vision of a mouthless face could mean a seal had been taken without thanks. Even ordinary people, when they dreamed of ancestors, would wake and offer a whisper to the wind, a song to the ice, so the dead would not feel neglected. As the Thule moved eastward, adapting to every coastline, they brought their spirits with them. From the fjords of Greenland to the stone circles of Igloolik, the songs changed dialect, but not soul. The sacred endured in tools, in carvings, in breath. Even as the Dorset faded from the land, their spirits were folded into the new songs. Tunit legends whispered to children as the snow fell, round and endless. Here, at the close of the first chapter, there are no ruins of stone temples, no inscriptions on monoliths, no names carved in bronze. But there is memory, etched in bone, sung into flame, and carried in the breath of those who still walk the white silence. Every gust is a voice, every snowflake an ancestor's whisper, and beneath the ice something still listens. The emergence of the Inuit warrior-hunter cannot be understood without first tracing the evolution of Arctic subsistence technology from the Paleo-Eskimo phase to the Thule apex, across a corridor of millennia where warfare was replaced by ritualized hunt and conquest gave way to communion. Between 2000 BCE and 1600 CE, across the northern rim of North America, stretching from the Chukchi Peninsula to the ice-glassed fjords of Greenland, a different kind of weapon was born, one not forged in fire, but carved by hunger, one not wielded in battle, but offered in reverence. The Inuit harpoon, known in later centuries as nunnak, was not merely a tool, it was a sacrament. Its construction began in silence, beneath the rhythmic breath of the lamp flame, its shaft whittled from driftwood hardened by the salt wind, its head shaped from narwhal tusk, walrus ivory, or caribou antler. The line woven from seal sinew was coiled not with haste, but with prayer. Before it could be thrown, it was spoken to, its spirit awakened, its edge kissed. To hunt without speaking to the harpoon was to call death upon oneself. Weaponry in Inuit tradition was not forged in foundries, for metal was rare and sacred. Instead, bone served as blade, ivory as spearhead, flint and chert as sharpened points embedded in foreshafts. The earliest examples from the pre-Dorset layers at Port Refuge and Igloolik, dated to 1500 BCE, show harpoon heads with toggling designs, mechanisms of intelligence rather than brute strength. These devices lodged within flesh, pivoted upon retrieval, ensured the seal would not escape. Their shapes, recorded in soot-stained stones and midden layers, bear testament to a people who knew not just how to kill, but how to listen to the anatomy of prey, the ice beneath, the breath of the sea. To throw a harpoon was not to strike, it was to ask. The hunter would wait for hours, sometimes days, at a breathing hole in the ice, body still as stone, spirit sunk into the rhythm of the animal. When the seal rose, the breath between worlds narrowed, and when the weapon flew, it did so with the weight of generations behind it. A successful strike was never announced with joy, but with silence. It was a moment of balance restored, not victory claimed. Among the earliest hunting cultures, the Sakak in western Greenland, 2500–800 BCE, and later the Dorset, small effigies of seals, bears, and whales have been found in grave sites, sometimes clutched in the arms of the dead. These were not toys. They were companions for the afterlife, gifts for the spirit world, tokens of a covenant between man and beast. Some bore etchings of spirals or waves, others of crescent moons, symbols not yet fully deciphered, but likely connected to tides, time, and the unseen. The bear or Nanak was not hunted casually. He was the great equal. To face him was to walk the knife's edge of life and death. Hunters wore masks before the strike to hide their true faces. The bear's skull was often returned to the ice or placed upon a high platform facing the direction from which it came. This was not superstition, this was survival, for it was said that the spirit of the bear would watch its killer. If disrespected, it would deny future hunts. If honored, it would offer itself again. Even among children, the sacred nature of weaponry was known. Toy harpoons carved from bone were given not for play, but for preparation. Boys learned the weight of silence, the patience of stillness. Girls were taught the sharpness of sinew, the stitching of clothing that would not freeze. Each thread, each point, each knife was a step in the chain of survival, a verse in the sacred song of subsistence. Archaeological remains at Kekatasasuk and Nuvuk reveal hunting caches buried beneath stone, wrapped in seal skins, marked with bone totems. These were not hidden out of fear of theft, but placed with ritual timing. Some were not retrieved until seasons later. The placement and unearthing were ceremonies of return, reminders that the land, too, was a living participant in the hunt. The drum, so often associated with spirit journeying, was also used in preparation for the hunt. The Angakuk would bless the weapons, speak the names of prey seen in dreams, call upon ancestors who had hunted the same beast centuries before. It was believed that the sea, though vast, had ears. One did not boast before it, one whispered. The ocean gave, but also took. Knives, too, were not exempt from reverence. The ulu, the curved blade used by women, held as much power as the harpoon. It cut skins, prepared meals, and tended the dead. In some burials, the ulu is placed above the body, blade inward, as if to guard the soul's passage. Others were broken before burial, a symbolic act of releasing its spirit to follow the one it served. By the time the Thule reached the central Arctic, their weapon systems had become elegant ecosystems. Kayaks built for stealth, dog sleds for transport, throwing boards, nugutak for enhanced distance, all formed an orchestra of survival. Tools evolved not for war against men, but for the war against hunger, cold, and time. There were no fortresses, but there were shelters. No battalions, but there were families. The enemy was not a nation. It was the long winter, the storm, the empty sea, and yet through it all, they did not break the earth with iron. They did not scar it with the empire. They carved their lives into snow and bone, leaving only the memory of breath, the glint of ivory, the line of a harpoon coiled in sacred silence. Let me know when you're ready for. The ritual architecture of Inuit hunting practice cannot be disentangled from the cosmological framework that guided it. A world in which every act of subsistence was a dialogue between soul and silence. Across the millennia that followed the emergence of the Thule tradition after 1000 CE, from the ice-hemmed channels of the high Arctic to the tidal estuaries of Hudson Bay, hunting the seal became the axis upon which spiritual, ecological, and communal survival turned. And at its center, the breath, that final exhalation from a seal's nostril as it broke the still surface, was treated not as conquest, but covenant. The act began long before the strike. In the pre-dawn hush of winter, the hunter would walk out alone, sled runners whispering against snow, his parka stitched with sinew by hands that remembered every ancestor's stitch. At the chosen hole, a glue, he would lie prone for hours, body aligned with wind and memory. No movement, no words, just the slow rhythm of the Quilik's warmth still lingering on his skin and the ancient anticipation that the world beneath the ice would answer. And when the seal came, just once, its eyes shimmering with starlight reflected through ice. The hunter did not cheer nor breathe deeply. The harpoon struck with precision, guided by years of silence. A thin mist of blood laced the hole's edge, but no sound followed, only reverence. The seal was never referred to as prey. It was a being of equal standing, a soul who had offered itself to the cold-breath people. Its body was cradled. Its flippers were not dragged across the snow, but lifted carefully, as if returning them to the sea's memory. Some hunters whispered into the seal's ear before skinning, promising its spirit safe passage. Others sang to it, low chants shaped by the mother's lullabies and the shaman's tones, songs that drifted into the snow like smoke into night. At ceremonial sites from Amajuak to the shores of Nettling Lake, archaeologists have uncovered circular arrangements of stones known as Inuksuit, markers not only of navigation but remembrance. Some sit near old breathing holes aligned with the stars. Bones scattered nearby bear signs of clean butchering, delicate incisions, absence of violence. The blood was gathered, not spilled. The organs are divided with care. This was not mere efficiency, it was theology. Elders spoke of the seal's soul returning to Sedna, the sea mother, whose hair tangles with forgotten promises. If the hunter broke taboo, took more than needed, left bones exposed, failed to speak the old words Sedna would hear. Her fingers, still aching from betrayal, would curl closed, and the ice would close too. No more seals, no more breath. Some burials show a harpoon placed beside the hunter, but always with a seal. Effigy carved in antler or ivory close to the heart. In the grave at Kilakitsok in western Greenland, dated to the 15th century, the mummified remains of women and children were wrapped in furs, with amulets sewn into the inner linings. One bore a fragment of bone inscribed with a spiral. Some scholars suggest it represented the breath, the final circle, the offering returned to the sky. Within family camps, the seal's arrival was sacred time. The meat was divided first to elders, then children. The liver was shared warm, raw, passed hand to hand like a blessing. The skin was cleaned slowly, then stretched to dry under the weak sun. Even the bones were spoken to, some boiled for broth, others saved for dogs, some carved into needle cases and ornaments. Nothing was discarded. The seal had given everything. The people, in turn, gave it back in use. The spiritual ecology of this relationship stretched beyond the visible. Dream hunting was practiced among many communities, where the Angakuk would journey in trance to see which animal was ready to return. If a seal appeared in a dream, swimming calmly, unafraid, it meant its soul was ready. But if it looked away, if it swam in circles, it meant offense had been taken. A wrong had been done. The community would then gather, light the lamp, and offer songs of apology. These rituals were not seasonal, they were continuous. A life lived in dialogue with absence, presence, and the cycles of return. The seal in many tales was once a woman. In others, a boy drowned and returned as a seal, his spirit testing the memory of his mother. The boundaries were fluid, ice and water, death and return, hunter and hunted. At Avaja and Kikiktarjuak, rock carvings depict hunting scenes that scholars date to pre-contact Thule populations. One shows a man, harpoon raised, facing a seal twice his size. Another shows a seal rising from the ice, its body marked not by wounds, but by swirling patterns that resemble breath or sound. These are not tales of domination. They are mythic reminders that every hunt is a reenactment of an older vow. When the body was returned to the sea, if a seal was not consumed, it was done with care. Its head pointed west toward the dying sun, its flippers aligned to the wind. Offerings of fresh water were poured into its mouth, a sign of comfort and of honor. To fail this ritual was to sever a sacred thread, and the wind, which remembered all things, would carry the scent of that failure across the tundra. Among the children, seal dolls were carved and carried. They were not toys but protectors, passed from hand to hand, smeared with soot, wrapped in scraps of aged fur. Some bore carved eyes, some had names. When a seal was killed, the doll was pressed to the hunter's chest, so the spirit would recognize kindness. These quiet gestures were not written in lore but lived in bone. And beneath it all the ice remembered, the crack of the hole resealing, the last breath released in mist, the hunter's eyes wet with salt and wind, the lamp lit in darkness. And silence, always silence, where the gods listened beneath the snow. The preservation of Inuit oral tradition across millennia cannot be disentangled from the elemental nature of their survival, where history was not carved in stone, but sung into the snow. From the fjords of Kangiksujuak to the wind-torn plains of Ikalaktuchiak, knowledge did not reside in scrolls or tablets, but in the mouths of elders, in the breath of hunters, in the cradle songs of mothers and the chants of those who watched the horizon. These were not songs of triumph, but of instruction, not paeans of empire, but verses of reverence. The Inuit sang not to remember glory, but to remain alive. The song of the hunt began long before the harpoon was lifted. It was learned first in the womb, as mothers hummed patterns of animal movement into unborn ears. It was repeated beside hearths, beneath lamps filled with seal oil, as the snow wept outside in silence. The child learned by listening, not only to words, but to pauses, to rhythm, to the way an elder's voice rose when describing the southern drift of walrus in a warming season, or softened when recalling the death of a brother swallowed by the ice. These songs were cartographies. Each verse described the coastline, its jagged inlets, the safe places for crossing, the cracks that would break a sled. Others spoke of the sea, how the beluga followed the melting edge of the flow, how the narwhal turned when the tide changed. No two songs were alike, yet all bore the same sacred purpose, to bind the living to the land, and the land to the memory of those now buried beneath it. Archaeological finds at Aviajuak and Kajatalik reveal ancient stone carvings, petroglyphs with curved lines, spiral motifs, and the outlines of faces whose mouths are open, singing. Though their exact origin remains disputed, many Inuit elders insist these are echoes of the Angakuk in mid-song, their voices carrying a cross. The stone, in oral tradition, such singing had the power to summon, not spirits only, but animals, ancestors, and truths buried by silence. Among the Netsilik, there was a mourning song passed through generations, never sung aloud until the seal hunt had failed 3 times. Then it would be whispered at twilight by the eldest woman of the camp, her voice barely rising above the flicker of the flame. Its words invoked Sedna's name not in anger, but in lament, asking her what wrong had been done, what promise forgotten. It was not a demand, it was a surrender. Children learned verses that named the tools, the quilik that gave light, the pana used to skin, the ulu that cut through sinew. Each tool had its own cadence, its own rhythm within the song. Some stanzas imitated the sound of the harpoon line tightening, others mimicked the seal's breathing, short, sharp, then still. To forget a word was not just an error, it was peril. In forgetting, one might misjudge the sea's timing or enter the path of cracking ice. The drum kill-out was the heartbeat of these songs. In communal gatherings, it called stories to surface. Not only epics of origin or tales of the first bear slain, but disputes settled, kinship lines recited, whether patterns recalled from a generation past. The beat held it all together, a rhythm as steady as walking, as essential as breath. The Angakuk used it to journey into spirit realms, but the grandmother used it to rock the baby. The hunter used it in solitude to steady the pulse. The boy used it to practice courage in the darkness. One song, preserved through both memory and missionary transcription in the 19th century near Kujuak, tells of a young girl who followed a caribou too far and was taken by the blizzard. Her voice, they say, still hums through the snow banks in late spring, guiding the lost back home. Another recounts the tale of the 2 hunters who crossed onto thinning ice and promised not to look back. When one did, the spirits took him, and his brother composed a song so that none would forget his name. These songs were not performed. They were breathing. Not all had melody. Some were monotone, others like whispered prayers broken by silence. They were never sung for audiences, but always for presence. For the snow, the seal, the stars. A hunter might murmur one while mending a sled. A mother might sing one as she stitched a boot, her needle piercing fur in time with the beat. And when death came, it came with a song. The body was wrapped in fur, but the soul was cloaked in music. A low chant was offered as the spirit left, so it would not forget the way. In some places, tiny drums were buried with the dead, or carvings of mouths etched into stone, so that even in silence, the ancestors might continue singing. There were no choirs, no cathedrals, no hymnals in this world, but there was wind and fire and voice. And in the spaces between, the Inuit placed their remembrance. Even now, when elders sing into the wind, it is not for performance, it is for continuity. For the line that stretches back unbroken from the whalebone to the blade, from the frozen breath to the last verse. And when the snow falls thickest, blanketing even the footsteps of the living, the songs do not vanish. They sink deeper into the ice, where silence listens still. The emergence of feminine ritual in the cultural matrix of the Inuit cannot be isolated from the cosmological terrain upon which it was rooted. From the ancestral encampments at Igloolik and Kajatalik to the semi-subterranean dwellings of the Western Arctic, stretching between 200 BCE and 1700 CE, women stood not as peripheral figures, but as central pillars in the architecture of survival. Their power was not shouted, it was stitched, not carried on blades, but on breath, on thread, on silence. They were not only mothers of children, they were mothers of the wind. Across the lands where frost buried every harvest and the only warmth was drawn from breath and beast, the woman became the lamp-bearer. In the center of the home, the snow-shelled igloo or sod house karmak burned the quillik, the oil lamp. Carved from soapstone and filled with seal or whale fat, its flame was lit by the woman's hand each morning, and its glow became the center of both memory and meaning. The flame not only gave light and warmth, it fed the soul. The hearth was the altar, and she was its priestess. The quillik was never struck without prayer. The wick, braided from Arctic cotton or moss, was trimmed with bone tweezers in rhythmic ritual. Songs accompanied its tending. These were not laments or lullabies, but invocations, binding the flickering fire to the breath of the sea, the motion of ancestors, and the flow of blood that bound a child to the womb. If the lamp faltered, it was a sign. If it danced too high, it was a warning. The flame mirrored the world, and in the pale amber of that fire, hands moved with ancestral certainty. Sewing circles formed in the early dark. Storms sealed the doors. Women gathered, each bearing a tool passed down generations. The ulu, a curved blade, half-moon in form as old as memory. With it they cut, scraped, shaped the hides of seals, caribou, and polar bears. Not one stitch was wasted. Each suture followed the logic of wind and cold. Clothing was not fashion, it was protection shaped by myth. The patterns were known by heart. The garments spoke stories. The hoods of parkas bore the curve of the mother's embrace. The seams followed the bone lines of prey. Every woman became a weaver of breath and barrier, wind and warmth. Archaeological layers at sites like Nuvuk and Akusiksalik have yielded needles carved from bird bone, all sharpened from tusk, and thimbles etched with geometric patterns, stars, waves, spirals. Some were buried with the women who held them, placed alongside child-sized parkas and scraps of fur. These were not merely tools. They were relics, evidence of a sacred lineage. In one burial, dated to the 14th century, a woman was laid with a pouch of sinew thread still wound around her fingers, as though she had paused her work only briefly. It was the women who named the newborns, invoking ancestors through whispered syllables. Names were not chosen at whim, but given by sign, by dreams, by visions, by the appearance of animals or shifting wind. A child born during a blizzard might bear the name of an old hunter who vanished in snow. A girl born beside a sleeping dog might be given the name of a grandmother long departed, believed now returned. The women were the midwives not only of life, but of memory. Stories passed from their lips like thread from a needle. They told of the woman who became a fox to escape her grief, of the child made from snow who melted when love warmed him, of the sister of Sedna who could sing wails to shore with nothing but her breath. These were not bedtime fables. These were survival maps of the spirit, etched in myth, sewn into the seams of life. Sacred rites fell also to the hands of the women. The first time a boy wore his hunting clothes, his mother would rub his face with caribou fat, singing to the wind that no spirit might confuse him with a seal. When a girl bled for the first time, she was taken outside the camp, wrapped in silence, and left to listen to the sky. She was not cast out. She was being rewritten. Wind would speak to her now in a new voice. Upon return, she would sew her first parka, her stitches watched closely, not for accuracy, but for balance. It was said a crooked seam could bring misfortune upon the whole dwelling. The bones of women, uncovered in ancient sites beneath permafrost, bear signs of labor. Grooves in fingers where sinew pulled taut, curvature in spine from long hours bent over skin, calcified joints from carving and cutting. Their tools, when found, rest beside them still. At Ulakaktok, a rare find showed a circle of women buried together, arranged around a broken lamp and a pile of unfinished hide. Some say they died in a storm. Others say they stayed behind, sewing for the dead. Even the dogs knew the women's hands. The feeding of the animals, the care of the harness, the braiding of sled ropes. These acts often fell to the mother, who knew which dog ran best at which place in the line and which spirit needed calming before travel. The dogs, like the children, listened to her voice. Her lullabies held not only melody, but direction, rhythm, remembrance. The mythic stories that emerged from this sacred center rarely placed women in battle or conquest, yet they bore the greater war, that of life against the eternal cold. And they bore it with thread and oil, blood and breath. The grandmother became the oracle, the mother the maker of worlds, the daughter the next vessel of warmth. In times of hunger, it was the woman who would eat last, her strength given to flame. In times of grief, it was the woman who would chant, guiding the soul to the stars with the same breath that once birthed it. And even now, in the songs remembered in hushed homes or whispered across tundra wind, the names that survive are not always those of chiefs or hunters, but of the women who lit the lamp, cut the hide, and sang the warmth back into a frozen world. Their thread was not just sinew. It was the sacred line of the sky. The emergence of Inuktitut as a linguistic tradition cannot be separated from the cartography of the Arctic itself, a landscape without script but filled with breath, where survival depended not only on movement, but on memory passed in sound. From the coasts of Baffin Island to the windswept archipelagos of Nunavik and the ice-throated villages of Kitikmeot, the language of the Inuit grew not in silence, but in syllables shaped by wind, wail, and waiting. It was not merely speech, it was orientation, a sacred rhythm embedded in the land itself. It did not name the world, it became it. The language did not emerge from conquest, but communion, rooted in the broader. Eskimo Aleut family, Inuktitut and its dialects, Inuvialuktun, Inuinaktun and Kalaallisut among them, formed a continuum across the polar north. Each sound was sculpted by frostbitten lips and mouths warmed by seal broth. To say snow was never one word but many, Kanik for snow falling, a puti for snow on the ground, Pukak for crystalline drifting snow that could not be stepped on. Each variation described not just substance, but story. The word carried instruction. It told you how to walk, how to hunt, how to breathe. The linguistic structure reflected the worldview. Polysynthetic in nature, words became sentences. One could speak a whole memory in a single breath. Yuvagut, we, all of us, was not a plural noun. It was identity. To speak Yuvagov means to belong not only to the present, but to the continuum. To the child inside the womb and the ancestor whose bones slept beneath stone. Yuvagut echoed across centuries, across ice, across the breathless spaces where written languages would vanish. No written text survives from the early millennia of Inuit civilization. Their script was snow, their page the wind, their ink the drumbeat. Knowledge traveled not in codices but in flesh. Grandparents became libraries. Elders bore maps on their tongues. A story told wrongly could endanger a hunt, misguide a migration, offend a spirit. Accuracy was sacred. And yet within the fixity of survival, the language flowed like a river under ice, changing subtly, adapting, reshaping itself to match the movement of people and seals alike. At archaeological sites like Avaja, flakes of soapstone marked with etchings suggest proto-symbolic usage, but the truth of early Inuit expression lived elsewhere in breath, in rhythm, in the pulse of song. The Aya, a style of vocal music still practiced across Inuit communities, carries the echo of these ancient transmissions. Performed solo or in pairs, the Aya was not always melodic. It was percussive, circular, hypnotic. Its sounds mimicked nature, the call of the loon, the breath of the seal, the rasp of the wind through bone. In these sounds, syllables were layered with meaning deeper than words could hold. Some words contained entire cosmologies. Silasuak, the wide atmosphere, meant not just sky, but all that surrounds the spirit of space. Inua, the animating essence, spoke of soul, not as possession, but as presence in all things. A rock could have Inua, as could a river, a storm, or a knife. To speak of these things was not a metaphor. It was realism in the sacred sense. Language did not separate reality from spirit, it wove them. Naming was an act of ceremony. Children received their names not for novelty, but continuity. The chosen name, often of a deceased relative, carried that person's memory, virtues, burdens. A boy named after a stillborn uncle might be treated with a mix of reverence and caution, lest the sorrow linger. Elders said that the name carried the kwangak, the spiritual trace, and that speaking it kept the ancestor awake. In this way, the dead remained participants in speech. Every name spoken was a summoning. The Inuit did not speak to dominate, but to remember. Words were not weapons, they were vessels. In storytelling, time was elastic. The past was not behind, it moved through the present like a current beneath the ice. When a grandmother recited the tale of the woman who became a dog to save her village, she was not performing, she was recalling, and to interrupt her was not impolite, it was dangerous. The story, once begun, carried its own breath. It had to finish itself. The missionaries who arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries with syllabics, adapted from Cree script, were astonished by the oral complexity of the people they sought to transcribe. One Jesuit wrote in his diary from Akilivik in 1834, "These people hold whole encyclopedias in their heads and speak with such precision of wind, of ice, of animal habits, that I fear my book will never match their breath." His fear was not unfounded. No transcription could catch the nuance of throat songs or the weight of a pause in a death tale. The oral architecture of the Inuit was reinforced in practice. Children were not taught in isolation, but in context. A word for snow knife was taught while carving snow. A word for mourning was spoken not in lecture, but at the burial site, when breath was visible and silence was heavy. Words became muscle, timing, ritual. Even laughter had its own lexicon. There were distinct expressions for the shy giggle of courtship, the communal roar after a feast, the silent grin of a successful hunt. Among the Inuit of northwest Greenland, tales of the Kivatok, those who wandered into the mountains and became spirit beings, were shared in whispers with precise language. The wrong phrasing, it was said, could draw them close, but the right cadence could ask them to watch over a newborn, to guide a hunter through fog. Language was power but never control. It was a request, a reverent shaping of air. Even silence held grammar. The spaces between words were respected. A pause before the name of a lost child, a breath after a blessing. These silences were not emptiness. They were a memory manifest. They reminded all who listened that the world was full of echoes and that every syllable spoken awoke something ancient. To speak Yuvagov, we all of us, was to invite not just those seated nearby, but those already gone and those yet to come. It was the tongue's acknowledgement that no one speaks alone, that every word is an inheritance and every breath a continuation. And when the language is spoken today, Inuktitut, reshaped yet undiminished, it is not revived. It is returning to the breath, to the wind, to us. The cosmological role of the aurora borealis in Inuit spiritual systems cannot be approached as mere spectacle, but as sacred encounter, a rift in the sky where time unraveled and the souls of the seen and unseen communed above the breath of the earth. From the windswept coasts of Tukjaktuk to the fjord-shadowed silence of Pangnatung, the northern lights, Aksaniit, were not just luminescence. They were memories. They were visiting. And when the sky cracked open in green and violet fire, the people stopped, breathed slowly, and listened for voices no longer bound to flesh. Among the Inuit of northwest Greenland and the Kivalurmiut of central Nunavut, the aurora was believed to be the souls of the departed. Some said they were warriors, swinging walrus skulls in celestial games. Others whispered they were unborn children, souls not yet placed in wombs, dancing in anticipation of life. Still others believed they were ancestors who came to walk briefly in the realm between snow and stars, offering guidance or warning depending on the rhythm of their movement. The aurora shimmered with meaning, and no two glows were read alike. Inuit cosmology placed no barriers between sky and land, between life and spirit, only thresholds. and the aurora was one such threshold. To whistle at the lights was forbidden by many elders. It was said to summon the dead, to draw their attention. Children who disobeyed were scolded not with anger, but with fear, the real ancestral kind. For the aurora could descend, wrap itself around the whistler, and carry them into the sky where no path led home. Archaeological evidence at Thule settlements near Talyok and across the Amundsen Gulf reveals stone placements and effigy sites aligned to polar phenomena, not for agriculture, as in temperate civilizations, but for ritual observance. Some are marked with bone carvings of eyes, wide and round, gazing upward. Others include alignments that scholars have tied to auroral pathways in winter months, lines of sight that correspond to corridors of magnetic light. To the sacred historian, these are not mere utilities. They are altars of the sky. The Angakok, the shaman, often bore marks on their clothing or drum to represent the aurora. Zigzag lines, radiating circles, dots that echoed stars caught in motion. In trance, some Angakok claimed to walk into the light, crossing through its curtain into other realms where animals spoke, time slowed, and ancestors stood in waiting. Upon return, they would paint the tale in sound, a rhythm of the kill-out slow and rising, like breath drawn deep then released through lips cracked by wind. Among the Kikiktaluk region, stories were told of a boy who saw his sister in the lights, lost in childhood, drowned beneath the sea, and now dancing above, her hands turned to flame. The family would sit in silence when the lights returned, offering her marrow and bone on the hearth, just in case she remembered how hunger once felt. It was not grief, it was hospitality. Even the dogs would pause. Sled teams, so sensitive to sound and scent, grew restless when the lights shimmered with flickering motion. Their whines rose into the stillness like echoes of some older knowing. Elders said it was because dogs, like ravens and owls, remembered the first sky, the time before the crack formed, before the spirits had to dance above instead of among. In modern times, the aurora is charted by satellites, measured by magnetometers, explained through charged solar particles colliding with atmospheric atoms. But none of that diminishes the reverence with which the Inuit continue to observe it. Science has clarified the how. It has not lessened the who. For those who walk the tundra at night, bundled in parkas stitched by grandmothers, the lights remain a living story, not a metaphor, presence. One song from the east coast of Hudson Bay speaks of the Inuit as a mother's veil, ripped open when she mourned her child. Each color, a strand of her hair turned to wind. Each pulse, the beat of her heart calling him back. No outsider could write such a song. It is born only from loss etched into landscape. There are places still, unnamed on maps but whispered in stories, where the lights are strongest, where the crack in the sky yawns wide enough that breath catches and sound folds into itself. In these places, rituals are sometimes performed in silence. No drum, no chant, only the presence of the flame, the snow, and the sky. Offerings of seal fat are left, bone carvings placed, words not spoken but thought. Inuit stone circles known as quilik cairns have been found in such regions, ringed with shards of soapstone and old ash, remnants of rituals no longer remembered in full. Some include child-sized footprints carved into nearby rock, as if left by the spirits who danced. One cairn near Cape Dorset bears a series of vertical notches etched into the inner wall. Some believe these count the nights of the brightest auroral dances or mark the return of a particular soul. There is no ending to the sky, no line where breath stops and silence begins. The Inuit understood this, not in theory, but in body. They did not name the aurora as outsiders might, as a thing apart. They called it by what it did. Aksaniat, the act of walking in the sky. It was not a noun, it was a verb, it was motionless, it was becoming. And so, when the sky cracked open and the lights poured through, the people did not cheer. They hushed, they watched, and they remembered who still danced above them in the place where the veil thinned, where all things seen still wait to be called by name. The emergence of Inuit civilization as a sovereign Arctic power must be understood not through the lens of centralized rule or monumental architecture, but through the distributed sacredness of memory, motion, and material. An empire of breath that ruled from Bering Strait to Baffin, from the Beaufort Sea to the fringes of Kalarlit Nunat. Long before the outlines of Europe reached the polar edges, before flags pierced snow and maps etched false borders into sacred ice, the Inuit held dominion in realms unseen, fortresses of ice, calendars of bone, shrines carved in wind and driftwood. Their kingdoms did not rise, they endured. No capital crowned this dominion. No throne sat above others. Instead, sovereignty was woven through sled routes and seasonal migrations, passed from family to family like sacred thread. Their palaces were snow-shelled Inuit, layered in silence and smoke. Their archives were the minds of elders, their libraries the living tongues of the people, speaking not to conquer, but to remember. At Kukpak, on the Mackenzie Delta, archaeological layers reveal the vestiges of massive winter dwellings, longhouses constructed from whale bones, sod, and driftwood, supported by knowledge of wind and weight passed through centuries. Some measured over 20 meters, capable of sheltering multiple families, their hearts spaced at careful intervals to share heat, stories, and blood. These were not hovels of desperation. They were citadels of wisdom, each fire remembered. Calendars carved from caribou antler have been uncovered near King William Island, grooved not in sequence but in cycles. Each notch marked not a number but a moment, the return of the sun, the thickening of the ice, the shifting of seal patterns. These were not static records. They were oracles, touched by the hands of those who could feel the breath of the moon on snow. No bells rang to mark hours. The sky was their clock. The river's thaw was their decree. Each clan was its own kingdom, and each kingdom bore no border but breath. The hermit of Enadai, the Salamiot of the western coast, the Netzilik of the central Arctic, all moved in sacred loops, bound not by territory, but by timing. To disrupt that rhythm was to die. But within it, they thrived, each group bearing dialectal nuances, tool-making preferences, hunting specializations. Yet all were woven into a single mythic fabric, like constellations scattered across frozen sky, but lit by the same fire. Driftwood was a treasure. On shores where trees did not grow, it arrived as a gift, from rivers farther south, from storms, from the old roots of the sea. Every log was sanctified by its rarity. A single beam could form the backbone of a sled, the arch of a roof, the shaft of a harpoon. The largest were fashioned into shrines, standing upright, etched with marks only the clan understood, adorned with bones and feathers. They were erected near hunting grounds or along migration paths. Some scholars called them totems, but they were more. They were place markers of spirit, touchstones of return. The animals knew them. Foxes circled them. Ravens perched. Bears avoided. It was said these shrines held the Inuit, the soul not of the man who built them, but of the relationship itself, between land and people, between spirit and survival. They were not worshipped, they were remembered, weapons forged not in steel but in story. The harpoon head, carved from polished walrus ivory, was passed down generations. Its barbs bore not decoration, but lineage, lines marking kills, circles marking losses. A hunter would sometimes press the tip to his forehead bee. For a long journey, seeking memory rather than magic, for the weapon remembered even when he forgot. And the seal, it was said, recognized the harpoon's soul before the hunter's. Bone tools recovered from the layers beneath Iglulik and Avaja show variation in carving styles, some elongated, others crescent-shaped. These differences are not random. They signify schools of craftsmanship, inherited within kin groups. The tools were signed not with names, but with rhythm, how they cut, how they held weight. Anthropologists have traced stylistic lineages through these instruments, following the path of unseen kings who ruled through motion and memory alone. The concept of leadership bore no crown. The Isumatak, he who thinks, was not chosen for wealth or might, but for wisdom. He spoke little, listened more, guided through suggestion, not command. When the hunt failed or the weather shifted beyond pattern, it was the Isumatak who conferred with the Angakuk, and the people who gathered in the longhouse waited not for edict, but for story. The decision emerged from shared breath, not from decree. Power was held in balance. The old woman remembered a song that called the caribou, the hunter who walked farthest without fail, the child who dreamed the truth in winter. All were sovereign in their gift. Their unseen kingdoms lay not beneath banners, but behind the eyes, in the rhythm of footsteps across snow too sacred to name. Time did not advance here, it circled. The past was not behind, it was within. A grandmother's face resembled a daughter's. A son's voice echoed an uncle's. Dreams revisited old paths, and when the snow fell in silence, they did not call it new, they called it returning. For they had seen it before in other lives, other fires, other kingdoms made not from stone, but from knowing. And then the strangers came, boots hard against the sacred skin of the ice, bearing maps drawn in ignorance and speech that did not listen. But even before that, the people had built something that could not be seen. A kingdom without walls, a history without ink, a sovereignty without a sword. The snow still remembers them, so do the stars. And when the wind rises across the tundra and touches the old driftwood shrine, you may still hear it, the anthem of the unseen. The geographic cognition of the Inuit cannot be understood through the logic of modern cartography, for theirs was not a world of measured miles and fixed borders. It was a world woven in rhythm, one remembered not in ink, but in pulse, in song, in the angle of wind and curve of drift. From the eastern coast of Hudson Bay to the glacial corridors of Karnak, from the edge of the Mackenzie Delta to the distant islands of Ellesmere, Inuit movement was not wandering, it was returned. It was reverent traversal across a sacred map that no paper could hold. The land itself was not silent, it spoke, and the Inuit listened. They read pressure ridges in sea ice as one reads a sacred script. They traced the movement of pack ice not as randomness, but as recurrence. They could name every inlet, every reef, every hollow where snow curled differently, each with a name passed down through centuries. These names were not decorative. They were survival encoded in reverence. Among the Igloolikmiut, a single region might hold over 30 distinct names for snow formations, each indicating not only structure, but time, danger, direction. Kinu for slushy snow near shore, Pukak for grainy, crystalline powder beneath hardpack. A putt for the fresh snow that covers the night's tracks. Every footstep was weighed against this linguistic archive, every decision drawn from it. Their map was beneath their feet and in their breath. Archaeological finds near Cape Bathurst reveal ancient campsites aligned with prevailing winds, not to shield, but to see. Some dwellings were positioned to face the rise of the sun at solstice, others aligned to the breakage of ice in spring. These were not accidents, they were a memory-made shelter. In one excavated site, a curved bone tool, possibly used for divination, was found etched with directional grooves, not magnetic but intuitive, not coordinates but stories. The navigation of the Inuit relied upon signs not external but relational. The migratory patterns of birds, especially the Arctic tern and the snow bunting, served as messengers. Their sudden turn in flight marked the coming of wind, the approach of storm, the turn of a current. The siksik, the ground squirrel, when seen retreating from burrow early, spoke of early thaw. Even cloud formations, wisps like feathers or stacked like stone cairns, were interpreted not visually but mythically. They were sky spirits whispering travel's fate. Star paths were sung. The belt of Orion was not distant, it was a walking song. The North Star Nikitsutuk was not a direction but a guardian. Elders sang its name like a prayer, using its fixed gaze as anchor. Children learned to count time by the position of sea. Constellations over the spine of the land. One ancient story tells of a boy who was led home through a blizzard by a dream in which his grandfather's voice pointed to Uksuk-Tuk, a place now known as Jijoa Haven. He arrived 3 days later, star-burned and frostbitten, but alive. Their boats, kajak, were not only tools of travel, but vessels of memory, carved to the measurements of their bearer's own body, wrapped in sealskin, sewn tight by hands that knew the movement of wind through sinew. The shape of the prow varied by region, taller in the west, broader in the east, each adapted not only to sea conditions, but to mythic understanding of which spirits governed which waters. No two were identical, each held a personal map within its frame. Inuit oral tradition speaks of Silla Tunic, a form of deep intuitive wisdom, an inner compass guided by spiritual attunement. Hunters in whiteout storms would fall into trance, not from exhaustion, but from entering the space between mind and map. They would pause, listen to the wind's tone, recall the rhythm of a song taught at a breathing hole years before, and then they would walk, not blindly, but through memory deeper than sight. And often they arrived home. The Inuksuk stone markers raised across the Arctic, are often mistaken by outsiders as simple waypoints, but they are more than that. Each bears specific shape and meaning. Some point to caribou crossing grounds, others indicate thin ice. Still others are ceremonial, aligned to spiritual events or seasonal migrations. The stones are placed not at random, but with sacred exactness. One found on Devon Island bears a split in its top, said to mark the place where a shaman split the wind in two, guiding the souls of drowned children home. Even silence held direction. A pause in a story, a stillness in movement, the absence of birdsong, all were messages. If the wind stopped suddenly, it was a sign. If a raven cawed thrice before flight, it was a warning. The world was always speaking, and the people listened with bodies turned to myth. One elder, when asked how she knew when the sea ice would crack, simply said, "Because it speaks differently the day before." Trade routes existed, not roads, but woven paths of barter and kinship. The copper Inuit traveled inland to harvest native copper deposits, forging tools and ornaments still found by archaeologists today in the form of cold-hammered knives and fishhooks. These tools spread far eastward, evidence of remembered trails where no written maps existed. From Ulakaktok to Arviat, families exchanged not only goods, but stories, each transaction another line in the invisible atlas. Among the Kalanat, those who came later and mapped with ink, the Arctic remained a blank space for centuries. But for the Inuit, it was never blank. It pulsed with memory, layered with meaning. Their map was alive, carried in the footfall of an elder, the tilt of a harpoon, the verse of a lullaby sung while stitching a child's boot. And so when they walked into the storm, they did not fear, because they carried the map in their bones, and the land remembered them. The first fractures in the silence of the north did not come with guns or flags, but with whispers, dreams disturbed, migrations broken, and the stillness of the sea shivering beneath a presence not yet seen. Long before the written accounts of Martin Frobisher, 1576, Henry Hudson, 1610, or William Baffin, 1616, there were other arrivals, unrecorded, uninvited, foretold only in dreams. The Inuit, whose eyes knew the storm before it formed, began to notice the signs. It began in the water. Whales disappeared from familiar routes. Walrus began to surface with unfamiliar wounds, gashes deep and clean like no tusk or ice could make. The birds, two Arctic terns, long trusted to mark the turn of seasons, flew strange arcs, circling then fleeing as if forgetting the path. The ice did not break when it should. The sun felt sharper, unkind. And in the smoke of the Quillik, the elders saw shadows that did not belong. In the stories that remain among the Avalingmiut and Kikiktalak communities, passed in quiet, there is mention of pale beings who smelled of salt and iron, whose boots cracked the bones of the land, and whose breath sounded like waves breaking rocks. They did not speak, they clanged. Their language came out like metal dropped on stone, cold and echoing. Some stories say the Angakuk began dreaming of a hollow sea, a ship with no spirit, filled with men who could not hear the wind. In one tale, a shaman walked into the bay at dusk and emerged covered in ash. "The ocean burns," he said, "but it gives no warmth." After that, he would not speak. He watched the shore until his death. Archaeological finds near Kimmerut suggest contact prior to the colonial record. Fragments of Norse chainmail, likely from Greenlandic voyages, have been uncovered in burial mounds among traditional Inuit grave cairns. Copper nails, unlike the hammered artifacts mad. By the Inuit were found embedded into tools repurposed by native hands. This was not trade, it was salvage. The material unfamiliar was reimagined, yet in no tale is it revered. The metal is treated as a curse, not a gift. It shines, but it cuts the soul. The Inuktitut began to change. Some were no longer wayfinding stones, but warnings. An Inuktitut near Cape Dorset was found with its upper arms twisted, pointing not ahead, but backward. Elders say that was the sign, turn around, do not walk further. The land beyond had changed its breath. The animals avoided it. The spirits would not follow you there. By the 16th century, European seafarers moved along the Arctic waterways searching for the fabled Northwest Passage. Their vessels, hulking, iron-nailed, bone-piercing, entered fjords like wolves into a fold. Inuit scouts watching from the ridges described them in the only terms they had: floating cliffs, bone houses, sea monsters that did not breathe. No paddles, no rhythm, just drift and hunger. Children were told not to sleep near the shore. Dogs growled in the night and would not eat. Some say the water turned bitter. Others say the sky stayed lit too long, as if the ancestors had opened the veil to watch what came next and could not look away. At Karnak, a tale persisted of a woman who carved faces into the cliffside to trap the dreams that warned her. She said the faces were trying to leave her mind, screaming, shouting in tongues she did not know. Her husband sealed the cave with stone. Later, when strangers arrived, the cliff split in frost, and the faces were gone. One of the oldest myths to resurface in this time was the tale of Uamajarit Tiganate, the silent ones who are not ours. These figures were never fully seen, only sensed. They crossed the land without touching it, leaving behind a cold that did not come from snow. In earlier times, they were spirits of imbalance, but now the elders began to say they were real. They wore skin like men but walked like shadows. Some Inuit attempted to speak with the newcomers, offering meat and language, but they were met with mirrors. Metal flashed in the sun, reflecting faces back distorted. A boy returned to the camp whispering in circles, repeating a name none knew. The elders called for the drum, called for silence. They said a story had entered him that did not belong. He was buried beneath stone, his name not spoken again. The missionaries who came with books and gods did not understand that the Inuit already knew of heaven, but theirs was not above. It was around. It was wind and bone and fire. When these men spoke of salvation, the elders listened, then turned their faces to the sea. The land would decide who was holy, and always the sails, sharp-edged like teeth rising from the waves. Their shadows fell long over the ice. They moved without sound, without breath, like omens carved into the horizon. After them, the world did not vanish, but something inside it did. The silence changed. The animals grew quieter, the dreams grew louder, and the snow no longer feels the same way on the bones. The first sustained colonial incursions into Inuit lands cannot be divorced from the blood wind of the 17th century, when foreign sails, driven by the obsessions of empire and the profit of whales, sliced through the waters of Ungava Bay, Hudson Strait, and Baffin's western edge. Between 1610 and 1700 CE, a long line of European names entered the sacred Arctic like iron through skin: Frobisher, Hudson, Baffin, Monk, Knight. But the Inuit did not record these names, not in ink. They recorded them in dreams, in frostbitten breath, in the silence that followed their passing. For the strangers brought with them not only muskets and metal, but fire without flame, sickness, dominion, and a cold that even the Arctic had not known before. The first to come were not soldiers, but whalers, Dutch and English, storm-worn and sea-hungry. They came for the bowhead whale, whose slow heart beat beneath the flowers of Cumberland Sound. The Inuit who had hunted the whale with harpoons of wisdom watched these men launch great barbed bolts from boats bigger than homes. Blood painted the sea. The whales began to disappear. The land held its breath. Trade began on shorelines swept with fog. Seal pelts were offered for iron nails, walrus tusks for copper kettles. The Inuit, whose tools had long been carved from bone and shaped by patient hands, welcomed metal with reverence. It cut cleaner. It lasted longer. But the metal bore no story. It had no ancestor. And soon the people began to say that it was empty, and that empty things attract spirits. The archaeological site at Kimmerut bears witness to these early exchanges. Fragments of wrought iron have been found alongside traditional tools, spearpoints repurposed from broken hinges, needles shaped from ship nails. And yet, scattered among them lie beads of Venetian glass and fragments of wool cloth buried in layers where no thread had ever belonged. These were not offerings. These were the first residues of unraveling. With the iron came fire, but not the kind that warmed. Muskets were introduced gradually, traded for meat or women, offered as gifts by French missionaries and Scottish privateers. The sound of their firing echoed across the tundra like thunder with no storm. Some Inuit believed the guns spoke with the voice of the sea. Others called them killers of silence. The first time a caribou was felled without a whisper, an elder wept beside its body and would not eat. No single invasion came. The conquest was slow and thus more complete. Each ship breathed too long. Each musket voice is too loud. When Henry Hudson's crew wintered unwillingly on the shores of James Bay in 1611, frost and famine turned them into ghosts before they could return. But others followed, dozens of European ships each season. By the early 18th century, whaling stations dotted the coasts of eastern Baffin Island and the western shore of Ungava, their chimneys sending up smoke that tasted of oil, rot, and lies. The Inuit noticed the animals changed. Caribou herds shifted their paths. Seals vanished from familiar breathing holes. Birds flew farther inland, abandoning nesting grounds near the foreign camps. Dogs refused to enter certain bays. The spirits, those whispered presences felt beside the fire, grew quiet or strange, but worst of all came the sickness. It arrived without sound, without shape, without cause. Children would cough and stop breathing. Elders would bleed from the nose, a fever that burned under the ice. Smallpox, tuberculosis, influenza, words the Inuit did not have. They called it the cold that cannot be cured. Entire camps would go still, bodies too frozen to bury. The wind passed over them and did not stop. In oral histories preserved from the Kivalliq region, some speak of a woman who walked into the sea with her infant, singing softly, because no one else remained. Others tell of a boy who lived alone on a ridge for 3 winters, believing he was the last. When a trader found him, he spoke only to birds. The muskets made hunting easier, but made hunger worse. Iron cut deeper, but the old ways were forgotten. Men no longer sang to the seal before the strike. Women stopped sewing protective spirits into clothing. A parka made from foreign wool did not carry the breath of the ancestors. It held nothing, it let the cold in. Archaeologists uncovered a mass grave near Repulse Bay, its contents buried hastily in shallow frost. Among the bones were iron pots, pewter flasks, a broken musket, and the remains of a quillick, shattered and cold. A child's jawbone rested against a copper kettle. There were no carvings, no names, not all resisted. Some adapted, learned the language of trade, crossed between camps and ships as interpreters, mediators, but they carried more than words. They carried grief often unnoticed. The Angakok, once revered, now distrusted, called sorcerer by missionaries, devil by traders. Their drums burned, their names are forgotten. One elder from Pond Inlet many generations later whispered, "We traded spirit for steel, but steel rusts, spirit waits." And still the strangers came. With books, with crosses, with maps that ignored what had been named for 1,000 years. The Iron Men had arrived, not all at once, but in waves. They did not conquer by sword, but by silence, by offering warmth that gave no memory, by promising God in exchange for forgetting the sky. The muskets still hang in museums, rusted and silent, but the wind remembers the first sound they made, and the bones beneath the snow have not yet stopped listening. The incursion of the Hudson's Bay Company into Inuit territories must be understood not as a mere extension of commerce, but as the imposition of a foreign metaphysics, one that measured worth in the tally of furs and reduced sacred survival into supply chains. From the establishment of Churchill Factory in 1717 to the expansion of inland outposts along the mouths of the Thelon, Back and Coppermine rivers, this British chartered company, born of imperial ambition and baptized in the doctrine of trade, did not arrive with armies but with ledgers. And behind those ledgers, silence was rewritten as agreement. The Inuit, whose relationship with land was rooted in breath and reciprocity, met the company's outposts with cautious curiosity. They brought fox pelts, seal skins, whale baleen, and walrus ivory, gifts from the animals they had sung to, hunted, thanked. In return, the clerks offered rifles, needles, kettles, tobacco, and wool blankets, items that shimmered with novelty and function, but carried no ancestral weight. Trade was not new to the Inuit, but this trade came with an unspoken premise that the land, the people, and the memory could be itemized. There was no word in Inuktitut for property in the colonial sense. Nuna, the land, was not owned. It was lived with, it breathed, it was. Heard, I watched. The sea did not belong to the hunter. The hunter belonged to the hunger of the season. And so when the Hudson's Bay Company began marking territories, building log posts and issuing writs in languages the Inuit could not read, they were not met with rebellion, but with bewilderment. For what had been given, what had been taken, archaeological remains at Fort George, York Factory, and the Repulse Bay Post bear witness to this strange covenant. Seal oil lamps rest beside tin kettles. Bone needles lie next to iron awls. In some sites, fox traps made of driftwood are found abandoned beside imported steel snares. And buried beneath it all, shards of clay pipes, shattered crockery, and the bones of sled dogs, left behind when the trade routes moved further inland and the sea was no longer enough. The treaties that followed came not with explanation, but with suggestion. The numbered treaties of the 19th century did not include most Inuit territories, but their logic bled northward. In the early 20th century, the beginnings of formal agreements, such as the 1939 Supreme Court ruling that classified Inuit as Indians under Canadian law, were laid not with Inuit consultation, but with administrative ink. Rights were extended not as restoration, but as convenience. The Inuit did not sign their names beneath these claims. They were spoken for. Missionaries played their part in the bargain. Moravian stations in Labrador, Anglican schools in the West, Catholic churches in the Eastern Arctic, each sought to replace spirit with doctrine and custom with scripture. The Angakuk, once mediator between animal and soul, was now labeled sorcerer, feared and suppressed. The drum was forbidden. The naming ceremonies erased. Baptism became a passport to provisions. In one account recorded near Hopedale in 1914, a young boy was offered food only after accepting a new name, one not shaped by dream but by church registry. He took the name Peter, but he whispered his old name into the snow before he left, so the wind would not forget him. The language of value changed. A beaver pelt was 1 point, a fox 2, a polar bear hide prized, but no one counted the cost in silence lost, in memory erased. Inuit women were sometimes paid with buttons, children were traded for school, and the map of the North was redrawn not in rivers or routes, but in property lines traced by those who had never walked the land. Still, the Inuit adapted. They learned the trade routes. They mastered the ledger. Some became guides for explorers, translators for officials. They navigated both worlds, 1 foot in snow, 1 in paperwork. But they walked between them with weariness, for the snow no longer listened the same way. At Pond Inlet, archaeologists uncovered a stone cache containing a British musket wrapped in sealskin. Beneath it, a copper kettle filled with snow-bleached bones. There were no signs of burial, no markings, only placement, a kind of message. Metal has been useful, but it did not belong. Inuit oral accounts from the West tell of a woman who, during the first trade expeditions, refused to enter the post. She said the land inside had no voice, that the floor did not remember footsteps, that the shelves whispered only numbers. When her son later returned with a blanket marked with the company's emblem, she folded it, burned it, and used the ashes to line the edge of her quillik. So the spirit knows what warmth is not, she said. By the late 19th century, the Hudson's Bay Company had woven itself into every rhythm of Inuit life, selling tea that weakened hunger, rifles that replaced ritual, and paper that replaced promise. The Inuit did not vanish. But the old ways began to dim, like flame fed with foreign oil, flickering, burning, unsure of its source. Still, in the hush of the land, the bargains were remembered, not in contracts but in wounds, not in ink, but in the cold that followed the closing of each ledger. The formal annexation of Inuit lands into the dominions of distant crowns began not with a march of armies, but with the placement of names etched onto maps by hands that had never felt the sting of Arctic wind, nor bowed beneath the silence of a white horizon. By the early 20th century, Canada's northern territories had been administratively claimed, their borders drawn in Ottawa, their designations signed in ink that froze no rivers. The people who lived there, whale hunters, ice navigators, songkeepers, were not consulted, they were catalogued. The name they gave was Eskimo. Derived from Montagnier or Ojibwe roots, it likely meant eaters of raw meat, a term alien to the Inuit tongue and heavier still in its colonial use. It was repeated in schools, official documents, trading ledgers, and census forms. It became not a name, but a mask. And under that mask, people who had never needed to name themselves were made foreign to their own reflection. Inuktitut, the mother tongue of the North, holds no word that div. Hides humans from land. Identity was relational, embedded in snow roots, kinship lines, and seal migrations. One's name was not fixed but evolved, shaped by dream, by elder, by circumstance. Names were sometimes carried from the dead, reborn in children whose footsteps echoed others. Some were given in song, whispered into a newborn's skin like a vow. To be renamed by outsiders was not merely an insult. It was the displacement of the soul. In missionary schools, those names were taken. Peter, Sarah, David, Elizabeth. Children were baptized with names from a book that held no wind, no ice, no animal breath. The syllables of their grandmothers were erased with chalk. Those who resisted were punished, not always with lash, but with shame. In some dormitories, Inuit children were forbidden to speak their language, forced to kneel on floorboards for every word of Inuktitut uttered. They began to dream in silence. The drums were banned. The lullabies are forgotten, yet not fully. Some carved old names into bone, into the handles of knives, into the sides of dog sleds. In 1941, at a burial site near Igloolik, archaeologists uncovered a slate blade inscribed with 4 syllables in syllabics, a name that matched no Christian registry. It had been hidden beneath a flat stone, wrapped in sinew, left as if to wait for the future to remember it. The flags came next, British, then Canadian. The North, vast and unknowable to the officials in southern cities, became a possession to be administered. In 1939, the Canadian Supreme Court officially declared Inuit to be Indians under the jurisdiction of the federal government. This legal maneuver was not recognition, it was categorization. It enabled the expansion of policies, permits, assimilation programs, and bureaucracies that would file the North into ledgers. The Inuit were now governed, regulated, mapped. To facilitate this governance, the government needed order, and so came Project Surname. In the 1960s, Inuit across the Arctic were numbered. The Department of Northern Affairs issued leather or plastic discs, known as Eskimo identification tags. Each bore a unique alphanumeric code, E7121, W3450, and so on. These were worn around the neck like military dog tags. The rationale, claimed officials, was to simplify records. But the result was a reduction. The name was now a digit, an identity, a file. Many elders remember the humiliation of that time. One woman in Rankin Inlet recalled being asked to recite her number before receiving rations. Another man, whose childhood name meant "he who waits for light," was known to officials only as E5286. When he died, that was the name written on his death certificate, not the one his mother sang into his breath. In response to this erasure, a reclamation began. In 1969, Inuit leader Abe Okpik initiated Project Surname, an attempt to replace the number system with chosen surnames. Families could select their identifiers, often reclaiming ancestral names. It was not a perfect return, but it was a resistance, a turning of face back toward the wind. Still, the legacy lingered. In school books, museums, and the media, the term Eskimo persisted. The names they gave us echoed louder than the ones we had kept. Even in scientific literature, archaeological discoveries in the Arctic were attributed to Eskimo culture, as though the people were static, fossilized, belonging to a distant past. But the wind never learned English. It still sings the syllables of the old names. Across the tundra, where bones rest beneath stone cairns and foxes walk trails worn by centuries, the land whispers what was never lost. Children now learn Inuktitut in schools. Elders share stories in radio broadcasts, preserving tales of spirits, moons, and migrations. The syllabics have returned to signage. Identity is not recovered, it is remembered. In 2001, Nunavut Arctic College published a dictionary of Inuit terms for snow. Over 70 words were recorded, each marking difference in texture, intention, danger, or sanctity. Among them, Akalokok, softly falling snow; Pukak, crystalline powder; Nutariuk, fresh snow drifted by wind. Each one was a word of place, of practice, of breath. Not one could be found in colonial maps. At a recent archaeological dig near Talyok, a fragment of soapstone was uncovered bearing the carved face of a woman, her lips pursed in mid-song. Carbon dating places it to the early 1800s, perhaps a pendant, perhaps a talisman. The style does not match imported Christian iconography. It is older, more local. It bears no written name. yet her face sings the truth of one. We were never what they called us. We walked beneath the flags, but we watched the stars. We answered numbers, but we spoke to the wind. We are still here. The systematic destruction of the Inuit, the Inuit sled dogs, cannot be disentangled from the broader patterns of enforced stillness and colonial design that blanketed the Canadian Arctic in the mid-20th century. Between 1950 and 1970, a silence descended upon the north, not born of snow or reverence, but of rifle fire. The dogs fell, and with them an entire rhythm of life collapsed. These were no mere animals. The Inuit were born of the land, bred from wolves centuries earlier, and shaped by migration, ice, and necessity. Archaeological remains of dog burials across the high Arctic, particularly near Resolute Bay and Pangnatang, attest to the sacred status of these animals. Some were interred beside their human companions, covered in stone cairns with carved amulets placed upon their backs. Their bones reveal diets rich in seal and fish, indicative not of domesticated subservience, but of honored partnership. Inuit oral histories recall the Limit as beings of spirit as much as sinew. In the darkness of the long winters, it was said they could see the paths ancestors walked. In the whiteout winds, they knew the direction of home, even when no star shone. Children were taught to whisper thanks to them after journeys, placing hands to their flanks and murmuring words passed down like psalms. Yet in the eyes of Southern authorities, they were chaotic, unregulated, unvaccinated, dangerous. As the Canadian government moved to centralize Inuit communities and impose sedentary models of life, houses, schools, scheduled rations, the Inuit were increasingly framed as a threat. Policies shifted, meetings were held, rifles were loaded. In 1956, near Inukjuak in Nunavik, the first known mass killing occurred. Accounts from elders recount Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers arriving unannounced, offering no explanation. The dogs, tied in traditional spacing to avoid fighting, were shot one by one. No warning, no negotiation. The gunfire echoed off the frozen inlets, louder than any hymn. And then silence. Similar operations followed across Nunavut, northern Quebec, and the Northwest Territories. In Pond Inlet, in Rankin Inlet, in Arviat, thousands of Inuit were slaughtered in less than 2 decades. No centralized directive was ever publicly acknowledged, and yet the pattern was chilling in its consistency. Communities whose very survival depended on dog teams for hunting, travel, and communication found themselves suddenly immobile, stranded in a vast white world without their feet of fur and fire. Some families buried their dogs themselves, weeping into the permafrost. Others left them where they fell, too broken to lift them. Bones were found years later beneath the snowdrifts, sometimes with collars still attached. Metal buckles rusted into the soil like blood turned to iron. The loss was not merely logistical, it was cosmological. For the Inuit, mobility was meaningful. A man without dogs could not reach the seal holes. A woman without travel could not reach her sister's childbirth. Elders could no longer make the pilgrimage to ancestral sites. Hunters, once guided by a dog team through labyrinths of ice, were forced to walk or stay. The songs of the runners, wood on snow, breath on wind, were gone. Inuit mythology speaks of a dog who guards the threshold between worlds, who guides the soul across the ice toward the village of the dead. To kill the dogs was not simply to kill animals. It was to sever a path between realms. Official records from the Department of Northern Affairs in the 1960s mention canine population control and rabies mitigation. But there was no widespread rabies outbreak, no epidemic, only the quiet spread of authority pressing southward ways into a northern body that had not asked for transformation. In 2011, the Qikiqtani Truth Commission concluded that the dog slaughters had profound, long-lasting impacts on Inuit cultural integrity. The report documented dozens of testimonies, elder after elder speaking in tears, in syllabics, in silence. They remembered the dogs' names, remembered their eyes, remembered the smell of their fur when wet with sea ice. At a dig site near Iqaluit, archaeologists recently uncovered the remains of 12 dogs buried together beneath a hill, carefully arranged, not dumped, not discarded. Each skull faced east. A seal bone charm was found beside them, possibly an offering, possibly a plea. Radiocarbon dating places the burial in the early 1960s. The bones had been clean, no bullet holes. Perhaps these were saved. Perhaps they were mourned properly. Some Inuit began to keep wooden carvings of dogs inside their homes after the slaughter years, small figures with eyes etched in charcoal placed near hearths. Not pets, not decoration, memory keepers. And in the spaces where dogs once slept curled around tents, lying in rows outside snow houses, there was now stillness. The children missed their warmth. The elders missed their judgment. Hunters missed the warnings they would give when storms approached, howling before the sky darkened. The land noticed. The paths grew over. Trails once worn smooth by sled runners became jagged with silence. Bones sank into ice. Teeth scattered in the wind. The Inuit did not die as dogs. They died as kin, as guides, as voices of the snow. Their absence became a new season, one without movement, without breath. The dogs are still gone, but the people remember, and the wind has not forgotten how to follow their scent. The spiritual decapitation of a people does not begin with fire. It begins with silence, imposed, recursive, and sanctified by law. In the late 19th century, and escalating through the 20th, across the tundra and taiga, from the Baffin coast to the Yukon borderlands, Inuit children were taken. Not by raiders or storms, but by agents of empire, church-led, state-sanctioned, doctrine-wrapped hands that tore the breath from native tongues and salted the earth of ancestral thought. The earliest state-sponsored residential school built for Inuit children arose in Chesterfield Inlet in 1951, but its structure had been long foreshadowed by Protestant and Catholic missions that had, since the late 1800s, moved steadily northward from Hudson Bay. Anglican missionaries at Blacklead Island and Catholic presences in Igloolik laid the theological groundwork for this cultural siege. These were not schools of knowledge, but workshops of erasure. Children, some as young as 4, were taken from their families under federal mandate. The term was assimilation, but its effect was obliteration. They were shipped by boat or float plane, torn from the arms of parents who could neither read the documents nor challenge the law. In forced dormitories, they were dressed in uniforms. Their hair, once braided in kinship and meaning, was sheared to the scalp. Their Inuit names, echoes of ancestors, animals, spirits, were replaced with English syllables typed on birth ledgers like brands on flesh. Linguicide was systematic. Inuktitut, Inuvialuktun, and the dialects of the Baffin and Keewatin coasts were forbidden in both classroom and chapel. Elders recall stories of children beaten for whispering to one another under woolen blankets, their breaths silenced with soap, their dreams bled into the mattress. Language, long used to summon caribou, to sing the birth of stars, to map ice through lullaby, was treated as a curse. There are records, government files marked with bureaucratic coldness, forms stamped with Dominion crests. The Indian Act of 1876, amendments in 1920 that made attendance mandatory, letters from the Department of Indian Affairs to Catholic oblates in Churchill, commending compliance, praising quotas, but the true record is carved into the bones. In 2008, beneath a defunct school site near Baker Lake, a burial trench was discovered, 9 child remains, unmarked, their ribs curved inward like hands folded in prayer. One wore a necklace of bone carved into the shape of a seal. It had been hidden beneath his uniform, a final act of defiance or memory. The soil around the bodies yielded lead levels far above normal, paint, perhaps, or contaminated piping. Many children never returned. Some died from disease, tuberculosis, malnutrition, untreated fevers. Others disappeared into the white space between truth and report, catalogued as runaways in school logs but never seen again. Their parents built stone cairns on the hills where they were last seen. In some villages, women lit quiliks, seal oil lamps, for lost sons and daughters as if for the dead, even when no burial was granted. Rituals were outlawed. Drum dancing, mask carving, throat singing, all declared heath. Christianity arrived not as a savior, but as a sieve. Under its roofs, the gods of ice and moon, the whispered stories of Sedna and the raven, were deemed wicked. The children seated in pews were taught of a foreign heaven and a god who bore no bone memory of the tundra. They were told to repent of their ancestors, and yet resistance flickered. Some children scraped stories into wood with stolen nails, foxes with 4 tails, men who spoke to the aurora, seals who wore the faces of old women. A fragment of one such carving survives in a museum basement in Ottawa, catalogued as anomalous Christian folk art. The curators do not see the raven's eye hidden in the corner. They do not read the syllabics scrawled faintly on the back, words for grief and fire. The psychological wounds ran deep. Survivors of the school at Fort George, now Chisisibai, recall recurring dreams of drowning beneath snow, of running across endless white fields while a voice shouted in English behind them. Generations of men returned unable to speak to their parents. Women came back unable to sing to their children. Mothers forgot lullabies. Fathers forgot the names of constellations used to hunt. The 2015 report from Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission classified the system as cultural genocide. Within its appendices are testimonies of Inuit survivors, told in trembling voices, translated into cold transcripts. One woman from Coral Harbour recalled hiding in a supply closet for 3 days after a priest beat her for speaking I. Nuktitut in a chapel, she had carved a snow goose into the wood with a fork. I wanted something that would still know my name, she said. Across the Arctic, archaeological teams now uncover layers of silence. Abandoned dormitories rot into the tundra, insulation spilling out like entrails. Children's shoes are found beneath floorboards, their laces tied in knots not taught by nuns. Paintings of snow and dog teams scratched into wall plaster with fingernails. But it is in the minds of elders where the deepest tombs lie, memories nested in silence. Some will not speak, others have begun to whisper again, and the land remembers. The rivers where children once fished in summer now run over with echoes. The ravens have not forgotten the songs, the ice has not erased the footprints. There are words returning in the wind, syllables uncoiling from under ash. And in some homes, grandmothers now sing again in the old tongue, their voices soft, their breath like smoke. We were never meant to forget, and the earth will not let us. The bones beneath the ice do not rot quickly. The frost preserves memory, it calcifies trauma, it holds the scream within the jawbone and the lullaby in the child's rib. In the lands north of the tree line, where the sun rises with reluctance and the wind cuts like ancestral knives, the past does not sleep. It waits, sealed in permafrost, tucked under centuries of snow and silence. Beginning in the late 20th century and accelerating through the early 2000s, excavation teams, some Inuit-led, others academic, government-affiliated, uncovered burial sites long forgotten or deliberately erased. Near Rankin Inlet, the skeletal remains of sled dogs were found beneath a rusted oil drum, jaws cracked by bullets, paws still curled as if in mid-run. A child's mitten, hand-stitched with caribou sinew, lay folded beneath the shoulder blade of one. Further north, on the bluffs above Pond Inlet, archaeologists uncovered an entire family grave from the early 1900s, mother, father, 3 children, buried in a stone-lined crypt sealed with whalebone and earth. Atop the grave was a rusted metal cross, but below it, older still, lay the ivory effigy of a sea spirit, Sedna carved with seal eyes, mouth open in silent lamentation. A blending of worlds, Christian death and Inuit eternity, coexisting in the cold. These graves were not only funerary, they were declarations, each uncovered jaw and femur a syllable in a language that had once been forbidden. A woman in Arviat, seeing the news of the excavation, whispered, "That is where we were hidden." Memory began to rise. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had closed its final hearing in 2015, but the stories did not end with its volumes. Rather, the testimony moved into the marrow of the earth. Elders began to gather, not for ceremonial shows for government panels, but for silent, candlelit councils in small community halls and canvas tents. They brought with them sealskin pouches, bones wrapped in cloth, notebooks with syllabics smuggled from residential school dormitories. One man brought the dried paw of his childhood sled dog, kept frozen for 60 years in a tin box. He wept as he unwrapped it. Anthropologists call it post-memory, but the land calls it return. The tundra, once made mute by displacement, has begun to hum again. The rivers that once bore away children in canoes now carry back their names, spoken by grandchildren who had never heard them aloud. Archaeologists walk carefully now across the fields of Kugluktuk and Igloolik, stepping between stones that may be grave markers, not merely glacial debris. The bones speak. In 2021, near Tukjaktuk, a school reconstruction project unearthed a cache of artifacts buried deliberately in a cavity beneath a classroom floor. Inside were bundles of string twisted into game shapes, soapstone carvings of raven and fox, and a set of tiny drums carved from seal hides stretched over tin lids. Ritual objects, made in secret, passed from hand to hand in silence. One drum bore the scratched image of a dog team running, not away, but homeward. On the back, a child's name, Aklak. There were no known survivors from that school, but the name now lives in song. A young Inuit singer from the Western Arctic has since composed a lament called Aklak's Run, in which the drumbeat mimics pour falls over snow. In it, the wind is named, the darkness is praised, the bones are thanked, but not all the bones lie still. In places where the government burned slaughtered dogs and displaced families to make way for airports and outposts, the land remains unsettled. In Nunavik, caribou herds avoid sites where dog bones were burned en masse. Hunters report tools failing without reason. Elders speak of dreams filled with barking, of icy footsteps outside their tents, of sleds seen gliding across snow with no driver, spirits unsettled, guides unburied. In 2019, the Qikiqtani Truth Commission released its long-awaited final report, Detail. In the mass dog slaughters between 1950 and 1970, thousands of sled dogs were systematically killed by RCMP officers and government agents, ostensibly for public health and safety. But the report confirmed what the people had known for decades, that the killings were strategic, designed to break mobility, end nomadism, and force Inuit into sedentary dependency. The dog, in Inuit culture, was not only transport, it was family, it was ancestral. Its murder was spiritual mutilation. In response to the report, some government officials offered apology, but the people did not seek apology. They sought return, and so they began to raise cairns. Across the tundra, families build new stone markers, not over human grave, but over dog sites. They bring bone fragments, pieces of harness, photos of ancestors with their teams. They light qualities beside them, offerings of seal fat and song. They do not cry, they sing. Because the bones do not demand grief, they demand memory. In one case, an elder from Norjat who had not spoken for years sang a lullaby beside such a cairn. Her daughter recorded it. The lyrics spoke of a boy, a dog, and a frozen lake. She had learned it before she was taken to school. The language, nearly lost, returned to her mouth as if it had only been waiting. And now, across classrooms from Iqaluit to Cambridge Bay, children are learning to carve again. They etch Sedna into soapstone. They sing songs that name the old winds. They speak of bones not as relics, but as ancestors. The past has not ended. It has only shifted form. The bones beneath the ice are rising, and the land pierced, burned, renamed has begun to answer, not in rage, but in memory, not with revenge, but with return. The regeneration of Inuit lifeways in the late 20th century cannot be divorced from the soft rhythm of needle through hide. As colonial legislation tightened its grip, and the echoes of church bells drowned out drum beats, resistance slipped into quieter forms. It did not raise banners or bear arms. It bent over seal pelts, whispered in syllabics, and hid sacred grief in thread. Across the Nunavut tundra and along the coasts of Ungava Bay, among the Inuvialuit hamlets scattered from Sax Harbor to Ulakaktok, women became archivists of memory and insurgents of culture, sewing new skins over old wounds. The art of skin sewing, once dismissed by government officials as mere craft, had never been simply utilitarian. It was inheritance, vision, and survival stitched into seal and caribou, with sinew passed hand to hand for generations. When the first Kalanat missionaries entered the Arctic in the late 19th century, they did not understand that a parka could be a hymn, that a boot, hand-beaded with crescent moons, could carry both warmth and warning. That a pattern held the lineage of a grandmother, her bloodline woven into the winterwear of her descendants. By the 1970s, as language loss accelerated and children returned from residential schools with English tongues and severed dreams, women began to meet in secret. In Rankin Inlet, an abandoned shipping shed became a sewing hall. In Kujuak, grandmothers reclaimed the back of a Catholic kitchen. In these places, the old ways were not taught, they were restored. Women laid out skins as maps, the northern hide of the ringed seal for warmth, the belly skin of the caribou for lightness, muskox sinew for thread. Every stitch recalled a word nearly lost, every cut of the ulu a prayer unsaid. The revival was not spontaneous, it was a sacred strategy. Elders, long silenced by shame, began to hum lullabies as they worked. They did not translate them into English. They sang them in Inuktitut, Inuinactun, and Inuvialactun, calling to the children who could not yet understand but would one day remember. Songs became protests. In Iqaluit, a woman stitched a story of the dog slaughters into a parka back, crimson beaded trails crossing white hide like blood on snow. In Puvenituk, a young artist created a full sealskin wall hanging depicting the Kalanat ship with blindfolded eyes, its hull stitched with crosses and muskets. The government labeled such art folklore, but the women knew it as testimony. Archaeological parallels emerged as Inuit scholars began to reinterpret museum collections. In the Canadian Museum of History, 1,500-year-old garments recovered from Kilakitsok in Greenland revealed design patterns that mirrored those worn in modern Nunavut sewing circles. Not copies, but lineal descendants. The continuity of sacred shape. Spiral motifs, always drawn from the curl of the narwhal tusk or the aurora's twist, reappeared in women's sewing from Cape Dorset to Arviat. Women who had never seen the ancient garments replicated their forms precisely. The knowledge had never left. It had only slept beneath the ice. Needles, too, became symbols of renewal. Where once the traditional bone or ivory needle had been cast aside for industrial steel, women began carving. New ones honoring the tactile memory of their ancestors. Workshops in Pangnatung began teaching young girls to make their own from caribou femur, burnished by hand, then blessed with oil and names. Each needle is given a soul, a fate. Some believed the needle guided the hand toward healing, and that a dropped needle during sewing foretold sickness in the family unless properly honored. Superstition, the missionaries called it, but the women knew better. The spirits of the needles whispered still. In these gatherings, language was revived, not in grammar lessons, but in the naming of materials. Natonic for sinew, Kamix for boots, Atigi for parka. Stories of creation were sewn into the seams. Sedna's fingers, severed and cast into the sea, were embroidered into mittens. The raven who brought the sun was hidden in hood linings. A girl's parka might carry the face of her great-grandmother sewn into its cuffs, eyes shaped from whalebone buttons. These garments were not fashionable. They were protection against the cold, against forgetting, against erasure. Healing lodges joined the resistance. Across Nunatsiavut and the Kitikmeot, small community huts, once converted into chapels or storage spaces, became sacred houses again. Women led ceremonies of returning. They burned sweetgrass alongside seal fat. They poured cold tea onto the earth in libation. They called back the lost daughters, the ones who had cut their hair, burned their old clothing, married into shame. They taught them to sew their names back into breath. In some places, quilts were created not from cotton, but from scraps of stolen life. Baby clothes from residential schools, torn hymnals, RCMP-issued blankets. Each square a confession, each needle is reclaiming. Government aid programs eventually attempted to co-opt the movement, branding it indigenous entrepreneurship, selling sacred garments in galleries, but the women kept a separate circle. In it, no money changed hands. Only memory, only warmth. And so the quiet resistance spread, not in marches but in mittens, not in flags but in fur. It passed beneath the radar of policy and the glare of the media. It sat cross-legged on seal hides in places with no names on maps. It whispered in syllabics behind government buildings. It stitched the old blood back into the young hands. A woman in Tukchaktuk once said, "They took our drums, but not our thread." Another replied, "We do not need war. We have weather," and so they sewed. And in every stitch, a land returned. The endurance of the Inuit cannot be accounted for solely by the resilience of their bodies or the cunning of their tools, but by the sacred heart that moved beneath centuries of frostbitten silence. By the close of the 20th century, long after the muskets had rusted, after treaties had faded to parchment, ghosts and schools had closed their iron doors, the Inuit still walked upon lands that bore the weight of their ancestors. The world mistook stillness for surrender, but beneath the tundra's white skin, fire smoldered. That fire was slow. It did not rage, it was memorable. From the edge of the Mackenzie Delta to the windswept capes of Nunatsiavut, reclamation stirred in low embers. Elders who had whispered through their teeth now spoke aloud. Youth, once trained to look southward for meaning, turned north again. And across these polar realms, a sovereignty of spirit began to unthaw. It did not come with declarations. It came with naming. In 1999, the birth of Nunavut was not merely a political event, it was a resurrection. The act of carving territory from colonial space was itself an ancestral rite. The stone, the rivers, the air, they had been returned to the care of those who had never abandoned them. The Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, the national representational body, became a drumbeat in bureaucracy, echoing the syllabics once banned. Policies were pressed into law, but beneath them lay something older than parchment, the memory of snow shelters, bone harpoons, seal oil lamps, and the covenant between wind and man. Archaeological sites once studied as remnants of the past became altars of revival. The ancient tent rings of Dorset and Thule peoples, found at sites like Kinggate and Igloolik, were no longer just scientific curiosities, they were homes re-entered. Young Inuit returned to them with GPS and bone knives, documenting what their ancestors had left, while harvesting what the land still offered. Stone fox traps, long buried by policy, were rebuilt. Kayaks of sealskins stitched in new hands floated in old waters. Language, nearly extinguished by classrooms that forbade it, surged back in immersion schools from Inukjuak to Cambridge Bay. Children whose grandparents had been punished for speaking Inuktitut now learned to read the land in its original tongue. Language classes became ceremonies. Each syllable carried the sacred breath of 1,000 grandmothers. Even the word Inuit, the people, resounded with defiance. We were ever gone, it said. We were listening beneath your noise. This revival was not nostalgia. It was a strategy. Land claims turned into protection acts. Oral histories were recorded and archived, not as relics but as constitutional evidence. The Inuit Circumpolar Council began addressing global climate summits, bringing warnings that were not forecasts but fulfillments of ancient prophecy. The melting permafrost did not merely threaten future loss, it unearthed old bones. Some thawed graves still held the tattoos of women, the hollowed needles of ivory, and with them returned the fire of presence. Artists led the chorus of re-emergence. In Cape Dorset, the Kinggate Studios produced lithographs and etchings that bore ancestral stories in modern form. Sedna rising from the sea, the raven devouring the sun, the shaman whose soul fled his body as smoke. These images, long suppressed, now hung in national galleries, but they were not for the galleries, they were messages. Proofs, warnings, in them the fire spoke. Some fires were quieter still. In grief circles near Kugliktuk, elders placed smooth stones in bowls to name the losses. One for each child taken, one for each dog shot, one for each silence endured. These bowls were passed to the young who added their own stones not for loss but for return. A language reclaimed, a song remembered, a map drawn by hand. The fire beneath the snow did not seek revenge, it sought balance. Myth too returned, not as fantasy but as framework. The Inuit began telling the story of the ice breaking not only in spring, but in spirit. They said the ancestors walked again, their bones stirring beneath Muskegon moss, that the aurora no longer danced alone, but carried voices. In some places, it was believed that the dogs had come back, not in form, but in wind, that their howls now shaped the blizzards, that no snowstorm was without purpose. Weaponry was never drawn. Words became blades. Declarations of cultural genocide were made not in battlefields, but in courtrooms. Testimonies delivered in quiet voices broke open frozen archives, and as settlements were signed and apologies read aloud by governments that once outlawed prayer, the Inuit did not bow. They lit quiliks, the seal oil lamps of their foremothers, and placed them in meeting halls. Their flames flickered not for mourning, but for memory, memory with teeth. The world saw suicide statistics and addiction rates, but it did not see the snow forts built by children laughing in their mother tongue. It did not see the elder teaching her grandson how to gut a fish beneath stars that had not changed. It did not see the newborn given the name of a shaman lost before Canada had a flag. But the land saw, the land always sees, and in the land fire moved, not with heat but with vow, not to destroy but to endure, not loudly but forever. The return of sound to the Arctic was not heralded by bells nor by sirens, but by a voice older than both. Across the frozen vastness of Nunavik and Nunatsiavut, where blizzards once buried song, the wind carried echoes again, not of conquest, but of return. In the 21st century, beneath satellites and cell towers, the ancestral drumbeat reawakened. It began in breath. Throat singing, or Kattajak, long silenced by clerical decree and colonial shame, surged back into air not as relic, but as rebellion. Its roots ran deep, predating the Norse incursions of the 11th century, older than the French fur trade, older than any inked map. Two women, face to face, mirroring tundra wolves and geese in their rhythm, their voices a contest of closeness and collapse. What had once been banned as heathen by missionaries in the 1920s now rose in defiance, filmed in snowlit cabins, edited on iPhones, uploaded to platforms unseen by colonial eyes. In the place of hymns came harmonics. In place of shame, rhythm. The youth were the heralds. In villages like Arviat and Saluit, children of exile lifted cameras to their elders. Grandmothers once forbidden from teaching Ajaja, the drum songs now stood before green screens, their weathered cheeks flickering in digital light. Each frame a resistance, each upload an offering. The elders sang of rivers that once turned red with char, of seals who gave their bodies willingly, of skies that never forgot the stories etched into bone. And millions watched, not only Inuit kin, but strangers from continents that once conquered. The land that had been mapped now mapped them. The drum returned. Burned in missions across the Arctic archipelago, forbidden in boarding schools from Rankin Inlet to Kuujjuaq, it reappeared, not in shadow but center stage. At indigenous music festivals in Iqaluit and Yellowknife, at gatherings where Inuktitut replaced English in the headlining act, drums opened the ceremonies. Round, sacred, taut with caribou skin, the instruments pulsed like heartbeat. The same hands that once hunted now struck rhythm. The same ancestors who had ed through the boreal silence now thundered through speakers. Digital resurgence did not erase tradition, it braided it. Inuvik-born artists remixed drumbeats into electronic landscapes, weaving Kattajak with trap rhythms. Videos filmed against northern lights went viral. Tattoos once hidden beneath sleeves now adorned necks and faces, marked in sacred geometry. Lines for lineage, dots for strength, arcs for the stories never told in English. Even TikTok, a platform born from global distraction, became for the Inuit a sacred mirror. On it, youth reenacted old dances, lip-synced ancient chants, showed beadwork, spoke Inuktitut, told jokes in the rhythm of survival. What had been erased was now archived in full color with hashtags. Archaeology, too, joined the chorus. Digital reconstructions of ancient sites like Kajatalik and Ipiutak allowed the dead to speak. Petroglyphs, carvings of human-animal spirits etched into soapstone, were modeled in 3D, spun by schoolchildren who traced them with mouse clicks, not chisels. Museums in Denmark and Ottawa, once hoarders of Inuit artifacts, now digitized their vaults. Elders identified tools their grandfathers had shaped, dolls their mothers had sewn. Replicas were printed, but meaning could not be replicated, it had to be remembered. The snow still fell, but it did not silence, it softened. In classrooms that once erased identity, Inuit studies was now a curriculum. Students learned how to build kajak, to hunt ptarmigan, to carve soapstone amulets, to film their own documentaries. Teachers no longer came from the south, they rose from the land. In one such classroom in Pangnatung, a girl asked if Sedna, goddess of the sea, could be animated for YouTube. Her teacher said yes. And so Sedna came, her long black hair flowing through pixelated waters, her fingers severed into seal spirits, her story no longer whispered only in igloo corners, but shouted in code. There was grief always. Some elders had died before the fire returned. Some songs were lost beyond memory. But the resurrection of culture was never clean, it was layered in ash. And that ash became pigment. Across cheeks painted for winter solstice ceremonies, across canvas and hide and the aurora itself, the sacred returned, not with fanfare, but with endurance. And so the Inuit stood once more, not beneath flags, but beneath the sky that had always remembered them. The wind that once carried gospel now carried drums. The missionaries had left. The churches had crumbled, but the songs remained, not translated, not forgiven, not gone, but it has risen. The emergence of digital life among the Inuit must be understood not as a rupture, but as an unfolding, an ancestral continuity adapted into code. The 21st century did not arrive like a flood, but as layered frost melting slowly into the tundra. In Igloolik and Tuktoyaktuk, in Talyok and Kimmirut, the satellite signals came, descending from orbit, not to overwrite, but to echo what was already known. Our paths and sea ice trails, once memorized by breath and blood, now glowed on GPS screens, but the bones beneath them were unchanged. By the time fiber optic lines and mobile towers reached the far north, the Inuit had already learned to shape their world from what lay around them. Stone for blades, bone for needle, skin for warmth. Now pixels for memory, code for survival. The young walked with phones in their pockets, but their backs bore the fur of caribou. They filmed in seal hunting boots. They messaged in syllabics. The old and the new did not clash. They circled one another like raven and smoke. The archaeologies of this age lie not only in buried middens or eroded tools, but in servers and clouds. Inuktitut, once banned in schools and stripped from signage, now lived in Unicode, encrypted in fonts, and resuscitated in autocorrect. Elders recorded stories in MP3 format, oral histories long committed to wind and skin, now rendered as waveforms, copied, downloaded, sent thousands of kilometers in seconds. The bones of tradition digitized. On the landscape itself, satellite dishes bloomed like steel flowers atop snow-laden homes. From them, children streamed language classes, drum dance tutorials, tales of Sedna and the Moon Man. Grandparents, once punished for whispering these stories, now taught them on Zoom. TikTok dances echoed ancient footwork. Podcasts reverberated with stories of famine, of the Kamutiak, of the long darkness. Where once colonial linguists had transcribed the Inuit tongue into Latinized grids, now Inuit youth subtitled their own films, restoring cadence, reclaiming voice. The integration of digital life did not erase the land, it mirrored it. Hunters, once reliant on cloud formations and bird calls, now checked weather apps before setting out, but always with the same reverence. The phone, like the drum, was a tool, not a god. In Clyde River, a father taught his son to spot breathing holes in the ice. He handed him a harpoon and then a drow. From above, they watched the white expanse ripple with seal paths. The old art merged with aerial sight. The ancestors perhaps watched from higher still. Camps became hybrid sanctuaries. In the spring months, families set up tents beside frozen lakes, just as their forebears had for centuries. But now solar panels powered small routers. Children streamed cartoons in Inuktitut while mothers sewed muklaks. Fathers gutted fish while answering WhatsApp calls. There was incongruity, yes, but also beauty, a paradox not of dilution, but of transformation. The spirits had adapted before. They would adapt again. In digital marketplaces, Inuit artists sold sealskin mitts through e-commerce platforms, their logos written in syllabics. Carvings of polar bears and shamans found homes in Manhattan lofts and Berlin galleries. A TikTok post by a teenage throat singer from Rankin Inlet amassed millions of views. In the comment section, someone wrote, "Your ancestors are singing through you," and they were, not as ghosts but as code, not in ruins but in rhythm. Ritual too transformed. The naming ceremonies of newborns, the prayers before a hunt, the stories told around whale oil lamps, now filmed, shared, preserved in 4K. A child named after great-grandmother received her name not only under stars, but under the blue glow of a camera lens. Her breath fogged the air. Her mother whispered the name. Thousands watched and in watching remembered, but even sacred memory stored in clouds risks erasure. Hard drives crash, servers fail, algorithms change. The Inuit understood this fragility, had lived it for generations. Thus, the digital archive became not a replacement for land, but a twin. For every uploaded tale, a whispered version remained. For every streamed song and echo in the ice, the land was still the first library, the body still the first code. From a divine perspective, somewhere above the satellites, the aurora danced as it had since time immemorial. Beneath it, humans changed their tools, their languages, their clothes, but the sacred rhythm remained. The beat of the kill-out, the drum, sounded still, now remixed and rendered in Dolby surround, but still speaking of migration, of hunger, of joy, of return. So the Inuit walked forward, not into assimilation, but into continuity. Igloos and Ethernet, elders and emojis. Star paths and satellite maps, all of it dancing, all of it is sacred. The emergence of a mythic identity among the post-colonial Inuit cannot be understood apart from the sacred duality they now embody, caught between realms, yet claimed by neither. They move between tongues, one spoken in syllabic echoes drawn from the wind of their ancestors, the other shaped by empire and taught beneath crucifix and chalkboard. They dress in synthetic jackets stitched by machines and in seal skin sewn by grandmothers whose hands still remember ice. They dream in pixels and spirits, in downloaded files and visions of Sedna. They are walking stories, half code, half bone. No chronology can contain this. No Western calendar, no academic lexicon. It is the history of paradox, where the sacred never left, only shifted its robe. In Pangnatung, a girl live streams the skinning of a seal, while her brother edits drone footage of a sacred hunting route. Their grandmother hums a morning chant beside a pot of boiling bones. The three timelines, past, present, and the one that listens beneath, all meet in that room, beneath a satellite dish and beneath the sky. Archaeology has not yet developed the language to catalogue this. The midden heaps of future dig sites will reveal USB drives beside ulu blades, snowmobile belts next to the sinew thread of sacred mittens. Ancestral dolls carved from caribou antler will be found wrapped in bubble mailer from an Amazon parcel. And still, the bones beneath will testify to people who never broke, only bent, then sang again. This is not reinvention. It is myth embodiment. Inuit identity was never meant to be static. Their gods were born of change. Sedna herself became divine only after her fingers were severed, only after betrayal, only after drowning. From that abyss she ruled, from severance she birthed. And so too the children of the North, cut from lands, from language, from breath, have found godhood not in return but in transformation. Inuktitut is now spoken by voice assistants. The spirits are addressed through Bluetooth. Snowblind elders teach youth with GoPro footage of blizzards. Animism is no longer whispered, it is programmed. Prayer beads are clicked beside keyboard strokes. Shamans record podcasts, and the wind still carries voices, though now through wireless signals, through cloud storage, through auroras refracted in hard glass screens. This duality births grief. It is not clean. The Inuit walk with old scars still bleeding, residential schools, sterilization, dog slaughters, maps redrawn without consent. The land bears memory in its silence. Beneath every step lies a go. But from these ghosts they draw power. They cook with ancient oil, edit with Adobe Premiere. They are called Sedna and Siri, and both respond. Across the Arctic symbols mix. A tattoo of the Northern Lights coils beside a barcode. A teenager's parka is adorned with both sealskin and streetwear patches. The bones of hunted caribou are carved into AirPod cases. This is not desecration. It is a sacred fusion. In the old songs, the spirit world was always layered over the fleshly one. Now that layering has gone digital, and the spirits do not protest. At the sacred festivals, those revived from silence and stitched with old rhythm, the dancers wear earbuds and bone earrings. They perform pre-recorded chants but channel live ancestors. Each step, a syncopation between software and soul. Each drumbeat, an echo of snow falling on satellite towers. There is fear, of course, among some, that the digital will dilute, that plastic will poison, that English will consume. But the Inuit are not passive. They are the ones who survived long before the empire, long before text. They encoded knowledge into wind and breath. They shaped worlds from hunger. They endured when even time forgot them. If anyone can make myths from metal, it is them. So they walk between the snow and the screen, between seal oil and solar power, between colonial wounds and ancestral dreams. They do not ask permission. They do not need translation. The gods walk with them still, recoded but not removed. The world will forget again, as it always does. It will assume the North is silent, that its people have vanished or assimilated, but beneath every algorithm is a prayer, beneath every update is a scar, and beneath every Inuit breath is a sacred vow to endure, to dream, to transform. And so, between aurora and screen glow, they walk. The political genesis of Nunavut in the year 1999 cannot be detached from the ancestral pulse that long predated it. To understand its emergence, one must first read the ice, not merely as frozen water, but as a scripture of endurance, layered in the tongues of the Inuit, carved in wind and bone. Nunavut, meaning our land in Inuktitut, was not born from rebellion, nor granted in mercy. It was summoned from the deep time of memory, conjured not with gunfire, but with breath, the breath of elders, of dreamers, of those who remembered when the land still whispered in syllabics. The vast sweep of territory, spanning 2 million square kilometers of snow-stilled tundra, glacial bays, and archipelagic silence, was carved from the former Northwest Territories, not by force, but by the chisel of diplomacy, through decades of negotiation, legal frameworks, and sacred insistence. The Inuit Tapirisat of Canada, formed in 1971, would carry the ancestral burden forward through maps and laws. The Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, signed in 1993, became scripture, a modern treaty born from ancient vows. This was not conquest, it was a reclamation. Inuit voices, long erased from the colonial scroll, became inscribed in parliamentary decree. The territory was not given, it was memorable. The cartographers of bureaucracy traced a boundary that had always existed in the blood. Iqaluit, on Baffin Island, became the capital, but the true capital lay in every sealskin tent pitched under storm sky, in every whispered legend passed down through frostbitten lips. Archaeological sites across Nunavut, like the Dorset remains at Cape Dorset, the Thule whalebone houses near Resolute, the foxtrap rings of Igloolik, attested to an occupation so long that even time bowed its head. The Kikiktaluk region, cradled by ice and ocean, bore the bones of every epoch. And now, with Nunavut's creation, the ancestors returned, not through resurrection, but through legal recognition. Memory became jurisdiction, but lore alone cannot heal. Nunavut's birth was sacred but incomplete. Centuries of colonial dispossession could not be undone by borders redrawn on paper. The trauma of forced relocations, of residential schools, of silenced tongues, lingered beneath the parchment. Many Inuit, while rejoicing at the dawn of a land their ancestors never abandoned, still carried the ache of those who had not lived to see it. Still, the land knew. The land always knows. Beneath every snowfall, beneath every wind-carved ridge, it remembered the names before the names. The rivers still spoke in Inuktitut. The stars still obeyed the hunter's path. Government buildings rose, blending concrete with local stone. But outside, dogs barked at the aurora, and children played on permafrost that had once held the tracks of caribou and shaman alike. Modern Inuit leaders, Paul Okalik, the first premier of Nunavut, and later Eva Ariak and others, stood not merely as politicians, but as echoes of the ancient Angakuk, the spirit guides of the community. They wore suits instead of caribou hide, but their task remained the same, to speak for the people and to listen when the ice spoke back. Nunavut's legislation began to shift toward language protection, education reform, and cultural revitalization. Policies were translated into Inuktitut, syllabics inscribed on official signage, yet the struggle was and remains immense. Infrastructure lagged, suicides climbed, housing shortages bled across the settlements. In sacred defiance, the Inuit endured. The creation of Nunavut was a sacred event, not because it solved the wound, but because it acknowledged that a wound had been made. It did not restore sovereignty, but it honored its possibility, and in doing so it gave the North its voice, not loud, not boastful, but elemental, like the sound of a drum echoing across a frozen bay. One cannot walk this land and remain unchanged. The silence itself becomes a language, the snow a scroll, the people its living scripture. Nunavut was born not in fire but in snow, not in conquest but in memory, not in bloodshed but in vow, and in that vow the land was returned. Not enough, but sacred. The establishment of Nunavut's government was not merely the application of Westminster frameworks upon a blank and waiting map. It was, rather, the slow thawing of ancestral law into legal form, a convergence of oral sovereignty and settler statute. While the territory's legislative assembly bore the external garments of Canadian parliamentary tradition, its soul was carved by the elders, those who had never needed written texts to govern, who carried law in memory, in silence, in snow. Across communities from Kugluktuk to Pangnatung, elders sat in quiet council, not in marble halls, but in community centers, hunting cabins, and kitchens warmed by caribou stew. They did not speak in articles and clauses. They told stories. They remembered wrongs. They spoke the names of rivers and the dreams of ancestors. And through this remembrance, law began to form, not as code, but as continuity. The Nunavut Consensus Model, formally established in 1999, bore their imprint. Unlike the adversarial systems inherited from colonial powers, Nunavut's government rejected the party system. Elected officials served as independents, chosen not for rhetoric, but for respect. Leadership emerged through consensus, echoing the traditional Inuit practice of collective decision-making. There was no speaker's mace, no gladiator's chamber. Instead, there was the circle, a remembering of how elders had once sat in the snow, deciding when to move, when to stay, whom to follow. The Legislative Assembly in Iqaluit was constructed with this philosophy in mind. Cedar panels curved like the ribs of a kajak, light filtered through like memory through fog. On the walls, soapstone carvings whispered reminders, the hunters, the mothers, the spirits beneath the ice. Every architectural line bowed toward Inuit cosmology. This was not mimicry, it was returned. Behind every policy, an elder's voice. Behind every voice, a lineage. In the early 2000s, foundational policies emerged that bore the texture of oral law. Inuit Language Protection Act 2008, the Education Act 2008, and land management protocols under the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement all bore within them an echo of what the elders had always known, that law must be shaped by land and land by spirit. One could not legislate the seasons. One could only move in rhythm with them. Elder advisory councils were embedded into the legislative machinery, not as symbolic elders on the shelf, but as sacred memory keepers. They advised on language preservation, youth rehabilitation, and justice programs, not as consultants but as oracles. The justice system too began to bend, not fully, not yet, but slightly toward the circle once more. Community justice committees were formed, allowing certain offenses to be addressed through restorative justice rather than incarceration. Stories became verdicts. Grief became teaching. Archaeology too affirmed this convergence. In the ruins of old Thule settlements, one does not find prisons. One finds hearths, whalebone houses, seal oil lamps, evidence of survival by cooperation, not conquest. In one site on Somerset Island, researchers uncovered a communal food cache with no locking mechanism, a system of shared survival, not hoarded power. The past spoke. The elders listened. Ceremony shaped civic ritual. When the government opened each session with prayer in Inuktitut, when decisions were translated into syllabics before they were enacted, it was not mere translation, it was transformation. The language of law shifted tone, cadence, breath, and yet there was tension. Western frameworks still lurked at the edges. Federal oversight remained. Budgetary constraints imposed Southern logic onto Northern rhythms. Bureaucracy did not always listen when the wind changed. Some elders spoke of this imbalance, not as anger, but as ache. The new laws did not always leave room for the silence between words, for the pauses that contain 1,000 years. Youth straddled the divide, 1 foot. In governance, the other in the drum circle. But the elders remained. In Arviat, in Clyde River, in Rankin Inlet, they taught the young that law is not a document. It is a dream held communally, and that dream must be protected. They gathered children into sewing circles and hunting camps and whispered the old ethics: never take more than needed, honor the animal you kill, share what you have, speak when silence harms. These were laws that required no signature. They looked at the constitution of Nunavut not as an endpoint, but as a beginning. As one elder in Talyok once said, holding a printed statue in one hand and a carved bone amulet in the other. This one will break if you drop it. This one will remember where you buried it. And so, beneath the formalism of legal code, beneath the weight of parliamentary process, there lay an older constitution, unwritten but not unkempt. It lived in the wind, in the silence, in the stories between breaths. The glacial rivers that vein the tundra, Kugluktuk's Coppermine, Baker Lake's Thelen, the sacred flow of the Soper in Kikiktaluk have never ceased their song. Beneath the frost-chattered silence of the surface, water moves like breath in the dark chest of the earth, and with it moves memory, not the written kind, but the kind shaped in bone, in birth, in the hunger of wind-dried hides and the rhythm of drums that rise from the old camps still buried beneath the snow. Long before the boundaries of Nunavut were traced in Parliament, before laws were inked on scrolls, the rivers held the first treaties. They knew who walked where. They knew when the caribou would cross. They whispered names that could not be translated, names etched not in language, but in the marrow of those who returned to the same bend in the water year after year, lifetime after lifetime. Archaeological records confirm this cyclical migration. In the Kazan River region near Enadai Lake, seasonal sites show layer upon layer of Inuit return. Flint shards, caribou scapulae split with practiced reverence, seal bone needles carved so thin they could only be made by those who had seen the thread of life stretched taut. Pottery fragments still hold traces of blood soup and snow-melted marrow. The dead buried facing the river, eyes toward its source. They did not bury their ancestors to forget. They buried them to remember where to return. And still today, the Inuit do not speak of land as ownership. They speak of land as kin. The land does not belong to them. They belong to it. And nowhere is this clearer than in the relationship between river and child. A newborn in Rankin Inlet is wrapped not only in cloth, but in a lineage that includes every bend in the river where their ancestors once washed their hands after skinning a seal. Names are given not randomly, but with sacred care. Often a child is named for a grandparent who has passed, bringing not just a name, but a spirit, a memory, a duty. The land knows this name, the river accepts it, and so the river becomes the first teacher. In the community of Kugaruk, the elders still take children down to the mouth of the river when the ice breaks. They kneel, they do not speak. They press a drop of water to the child's lips. It is not baptism, it is a remembrance. This is where you came from, they say. This river knew your name before you were born. When the Canadian government established formal maps, they drew straight lines, but the Inuit never moved in straight lines. They followed wind and hunger and sky. They followed stories, and those stories bled across what the government called boundaries, but what the Inuit knew as breathing lines. The river does not care for such names. Elder Pitsiolak of Iqaluit once said, "The river remembers things the government does not." It remembers the forced relocations of the 1950s, when the Inuit were placed by Ottawa in high Arctic settlements like Grise Fiord and Resolute, without knowledge of the terrain and without warning. The river remembers the dogs slaughtered by RCMP officers, thousands of sled dogs shot between the 1950s and 1970s, breaking not only the mode of transport, but the sinew of memory. Dogs, too, knew the rivers. They ran beside them, drank from them. Found fish for hungry children. They were not beasts, they were family. But the river does not only remember grief, it remembers the taste of oil lamps burning through polar night, the laughter of girls learning to sew muklaks in winter silence, the ash of campfires made from driftwood brought down from ancient forests long gone. It remembers the seal hunting songs, ululation that once ran across frozen bays like bird calls to the spirits. It remembers the kayak races, the drum dances forbidden by missionaries, now returned with fury and joy. It remembers a people not broken but bending. And every year when the thaw comes, the river brings back pieces of the past. Walrus bones long buried, tools loose from permafrost, a child's comb car. Ved from caribou antler, its teeth worn smooth by time. These are not artifacts, they are messages. In 2019, a team near Jijoa Haven unearthed a site with layers dating back nearly 800 years. Among the finds was a quilik, an Inuit stone lamp, still coated with the soot of seal oil. It had not been extinguished. It had been paused. In modern cities, memory is kept in servers. In the north, it is kept in rivers. And so it is no surprise that when a child is born, the grandmother often looks first to the water, not to measure depth, but to ask it something. Will this one remember? Will this one return? Because in every generation, the river needs one who listens, one who carries the shape of its curve in their walking, one who can read the echo of melt beneath silence, one who understands that the future is not ahead, it is behind, pulling us backward toward origin. The land can be sold. The government can draw new lines, but the river cannot be fooled. The river remembers who it first fed, and it will not be forgotten. The southern shores of Somerset Island, the windswept coastlines of Kikiktaluk, and the cold-lipped bays of Herschel Island all bear the same scars, arch-like vertebrae bleaching in the sun, rib cages rising from the tundra like cathedral ruins, and skulls of bowhead whales resting in slow collapse beneath the open sky. Here at the edge of the world, the land remembers a time before desecration, when the Inuit sang to giants of the sea and laid their bones in sanctified lines. The bowhead whale, Arvik, was not hunted as prey, but received as a guest, as sacrifice. In the 12th to 16th centuries, as Thule migration patterns swept east from Alaska across the archipelagos of Arctic Canada, these immense mammals were central to subsistence, ceremony, and cosmology. Archaeological findings at sites like Nungiuvik and Karharakiak have revealed communal houses built of stone and whale bone, oriented toward the sea, surrounded by storage caches filled with oil-soaked pottery and worked ivory. A house was not built merely for shelter, it was made to echo the ribcage of the whale, to inhabit its memory. The people slept inside the remembrance of the animal they revered. And with every windstorm, the bones outside would groan and sing, as if the creature still breathed beneath the snow. At Inanguak, excavation has revealed carved bone amulets placed beneath entrance thresholds, inscribed with flowing lines that resemble tidal motion, charms meant to keep the soul of the whale from wandering, to invite it back again. But in the 19th century, the silence was broken. Yankee whalers from New Bedford, Dutch ships from Amsterdam, and Scottish vessels from Dundee began pressing northward seeking oil. Not the sacred kind that warmed igloos and sealed skin boats, but industrial oil, lamp oil, profit oil, oil to make the world below brighter while the north grew dimmer. The killing was not reciprocal, not ceremonial. The bones piled, the meat rotted. At Herschel Island's Pauline Cove, in the late 1800s, up to 1,500 men overwintered among the whale bones. Archaeological layers show sudden disruptions: foreign pottery, metal canisters, tobacco tins, glass beads. Alongside these, the shattered ulus of Inuit women, broken tools, and disrupted hearth patterns. The bones of whales were no longer aligned by ritual. They lay tangled in heaps, their songs buried in silence. Inuit oral histories tell of this grief. In Uamanak, elders recount how the whales stopped coming close to shore, how hunters would wait with harpoons ready, but the sea remained empty, the songs stilled beneath the ice. And yet the ancestors sang. In the whalebone ribs left behind, children played. In the sun-bleached mandibles, elders whispered stories. A bowhead skull in Jijoa Haven was turned into a drum stage, where a child born long after the last hunt danced barefoot atop sacred bone, and the winds began to carry the songs again. In the 1970s, with the rise of Inuit land claims and cultural revival, attention returned to the whalebone ruins. Archaeologists returned not just with trowels, but with listening. At Deline and Arctic Bay, joint studies between scientists and elders mapped out ceremonial sites where whale bones had been intentionally placed in solar orientations, aligned with the solstice sun and the migratory paths of birds. These were not leftovers, they were monuments. In 1982, the bones at Kilakitsok, long forgotten, were found with mummified remains of women and children, some still wearing bone necklaces, amulets for safe passage into the ice realm. These bones bore witness not just to death, but to songs woven into death. For the Inuit, the whale was never gone. It became cloud, it became driftwood, it became lullaby. Modern art in Nunavut now returns to these forms. Sculptors shape serpentine stone into bowhead curves. Throat singers imitate the breath of whales beneath the ice. And in schools, children learn not only the anatomy of whale, but the names Tugak, the lone traveler, Silikik, the whale who returned after death. In these stories, the whale speaks, it remembers, and on some Arctic shores, the wind still rushes through the hollow bones, playing songs older than maps, older than borders. Where Western sailors saw waste, the Inuit saw structure. Where the world heard silence, the Inuit heard ancestors. Even now, satellite imagery over the north shows strange geometric shapes near abandoned whaling stations, bone circles, faint outlines of forgotten igloos, bones arranged not by wind, but by will. The land has not been forgotten. The snow still settles gently into the vertebrae. Ravens still perch upon the skulls. Children still run their fingers along the grooves, tracing the spiral of time. And when storms rise, when the ice cracks with a sound like rib bones splitting, those who still remember press their ears to the wind. They say you can still hear them, the whales, the ancestors, the song that never ended. It only went beneath the sea. The permanence of a people cannot be measured in maps. When borders shift and languages fall silent, when census forms fail to see, and textbooks grow brittle with absence, still some endure. Across the broken white sprawl of the Kitikmeot, through the basalt shadows of Baffin Island's fjords, and into the steel-lit corridors of Geneva and New York, the Inuit walk, not as relics of Arctic pasts, but as anchors of ancestral presence. The tale of erasure is not only false, it is itself an erasure. The Inuit were never removed, only quieted, suppressed not by absence but by noise, of colonizers' pen strokes, of boarding school bells, of oil drills boring through sacred tundra. Yet silence among the Inuit is not defeat. It is structured. It is a memory. It is a breath between drum beats. Throughout the late 20th century, anthropologists and historians mistakenly recorded the Inuit as disappearing, assimilated, or post-traditional. But the land kept a different ledger. In the 1960s and 70s, the forced relocations of Inuit families to high Arctic settlements such as Grise Fjord and Resolute Bay attempted to fragment community cohesion. Yet even in exile, elders rebuilt rituals. Whale blubber still burned in Quillic lamps. Children still learned the stars from the backs of their mothers' parkas. At the former Catholic mission site in Paniqui, stone foundations crumble, but beside them new structures rise, Inuit-owned arts cooperatives, rooted in ancestral stone cutting. The same hands that once carved soapstone to preserve spirits now press touchscreen tablets to upload the soul of the tundra to the digital cloud. What was once sketched in sinew is now coded in light. But the story does not change. The Inuit who never left began to be seen again in the 1990s. The founding of the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, the Inuit Circumpolar Council, and the reassertion of land rights under the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement marked a rising echo of presence. No longer footnotes beneath fur trade history, the Inuit became authors of constitutions, treaties, and international summits. In 2007, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, born in Kuujjuaq, stood before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and declared that climate change was not only a threat to survival, but an attack on culture. Her voice, shaped by snow and sorrow, rippled outward through global microphones. To some, it was policy, to others, prophecy, and beneath her words, the old gods stirred. In Inuit cosmology, Sedna, the sea mother who lost her fingers to her father's betrayal, sleeps in the ocean's darkness, her moods reflected in ice thickness and marine harvests. When injustice reigned, when taboos were broken, it was said Sedna would turn away, withholding bounty. And so, in the melting ice, in the thinning caribou, in the silence of walrus shores, the myth whispered forward. The balance was breached. Yet the shamans of memory did not remain hidden. In Clyde River, youth took up drones not to surveil, but to map traditional hunting routes now blocked by multinational extraction. In Arviat, language immersion schools began reciting not only vocabulary, but ancient praise chants to Sela, the breath spirit of the world. Each syllable is a resurrection. Archaeological efforts shifted too. Where once Inuit artifacts were extracted and sealed in museum basements in Ottawa or Copenhagen, a new paradigm rose, one of return. The bones were coming home. In 2019, remains from the ill-fated Franklin expedition, found within the sovereign hunting grounds of Nunavut, were reburied not by state decree but with Inuit ceremony, a reversal of silence, a gesture toward repair. Still, the bones of injustice remain. The high suicide rates, the poisoned drinking water in remote settlements, the persistent food insecurity, all speak of wounds left festering. But the Inuit walk through these too, not untouched, but unbroken. Their feet press the same snow their ancestors did. Their names, Tuktu, Siasi, Aput, Ningiuk, still carry the weight of stories that predate clocks. Some walk in snowshoes, some in rubber boots. Some speak Inuktitut in sacred full, others interlace English with ancestral breath. Some protest with placards, others with carvings, others with silence, but all remain. In 2023, when the Nunavut Planning Commission released its final land use plan, a document spanning over a decade of consultation, Inuit voices were not quoted, they were central. The rivers to be protected, the grave sites to be honored, the hunting corridors to remain untouched, all came from memory, not bureaucracy. This is what it means to never leave, to live not as ruins, but as rhythm. In Kinggate, a child draws a raven with graphite stolen from the cold. Her grandmother once carved the same bird into walrus tusk. Her daughter will animate it in digital light. They do not see a broken line, they see a circle. And so, in the council chambers, in the stone-cutting huts, in the quiet where snow falls on frozen sealskin, they walk. They walk not behind history, but through it. The world may forget names, the maps may redraw borders, but the wind knows the shape of their lungs. The bones know the direction they rest. And even when no one is looking, the Inuit walk on. Between glaciers and fire, between silence and flame, between what was taken and what never could be, they were never gone, they only waited. The myth of ending dissolves in the lands of midnight. For here, where the sun forgets to close its eyes, the story does not finish. It stretches endless, echoing, beneath the gold-lit ceiling of the Arctic summer, where shadows vanish but memory endures. The Inuit, shaped by time's coldest breath and fireless light, do not live in the past. They breathe it forward. From the ice-bladed horizons of Kikiktaluk to the volcanic stone fields of Kivalliq, the tundra keeps unfolding, not as relics, but as scripture. Each season writes a verse. Each footfall recites a vow. They still walk the veins of their land, between shale cliffs and frozen estuaries, past the cairns their ancestors built to call caribou from the wind. The Inuktitut stands as silent grammar across the silence. To outsiders, they are symbols. To the Inuit, they are voices. Modernity did not melt them. It merely changed their shape. Across the hamlets of Nunatsiavut and the coasts of Inuvialuit, homes now shimmer with satellite dishes, but inside, stories flow like oil through sealskin lamps. A grandmother's voice carries the old syllables, Uvanga, Nuliajuk, Tuniat, wrapping the new generation in inherited fire. Archaeologists once thought they'd mapped the whole Inuit story in bones and broken blades. But no trowel can touch what is still living. The sacred is not buried, it is spoken. In 2021, at the edge of the Mackenzie Delta, researchers uncovered a 500-year-old tool cache sealed beneath driftwood and loess. Among the ulu blades and sinew needles was a child's carved amulet, a bear with no eyes. Elders gathered at the site said nothing at first. Then one began to hum, soft, mournful, circular. The bear, they said, still watched, even blind, even buried. There is no archaeological word for that. The sky itself has become a witness. In the territories where night refuses to fall, the solar arc stretches low and wide, an unblinking flame across the sea ice. Under it, young Inuit artists press synthetic pigments onto sealskin, recreating ancestral visions, transforming drum songs into animation, transforming grief into digital archives. One paints Sedna's fingers as galaxies. Another programs a video game set in the time before the snowmobile. They do not ask permission from history. They carry it in their blood. The sound of throats singing, Katajak, now echoes in global concert halls. When sung in the darkened circles of Arctic winter, without microphone or applause, it still opens the same doorway. Breath against breath, voice against voice, two women pull the wind back through their throats, stitching the sky to the sea, the present to the first ice. And still beneath them the permafrost moans. It releases bones not meant to surface again. Animal, human, sacred. From the edges of melting glaciers rise tusks and spears and unremembered ancestors. These are not returns. These are reminders. The Inuit bury their dead shallow, not from neglect, but reverence. In a land where the ground never thaws, depth is not descent, it is preservation. And so the bones lie just beneath the moss, whispering. Some grave are wrapped in stone, some in wood, some only in the sky. In 2015, a team near Igloolik unearthed a burial, a woman with seal-tooth beads woven into her hair, and beside her, a tool etched with spirals that matched no known pattern. It was not dated by carbon, but by memory. The elders who viewed it said, she was one of the ones who sang to the animals. In the worldview of the Inuit, animals are not lesser, they are kind, and when the world was formed, it was not by conquest, but by conversation, with raven, with seal, with wind. That covenant has never broken. Even as climate collapse scrapes the ice thin, even as migration routes shatter, the Inuit return offerings to the sea after every hunt. They apologize before they strike. They mourn what they must take. This is not superstition. It is structured. It is ethics braided with cold. At the very edge of the known world in Ulakaktok, where the sun does not rise for 40 days in winter and refuses to set for 50 in summer, youth gather in cultural centers to practice the things outsiders thought extinct. The ceremonial lighting of the quilik, the weaving of grass into rope, the reading of ice by sound alone. They whisper to eternity not in books, but in snow tracks, skin stitch, fire ash, blood. And eternity listens, because the Inuit are not fossils. They are fires that endures without wood. They are winds that carve stone without breaking it. They are memory wrapped in motion. The world may rename them, may misunderstand, may ignore, may even try again to erase. But under the sky that never sets, they continue, not just as people, not just as a story, but as law. Law written in frost, in footstep, in grief, in knowing. And when this age passes, when wires rust and servers fail, when maps fade and nations fall, the ancestors will still be singing, and the people of the cold breath will still be walking beneath the sky that never sets.